What if becoming human was never a planned step in evolution, but the result of a long chain of accidents, survival, and tiny changes no one could see at the time deep in ancient Africa? One ape lineage began to change in ways that would eventually reshape the world. But it did not happen all at once, and it did not happen the way most people think. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The change does not begin with a triumph. It begins in shade, in damp soil, in branches that still hold the weight of bodies built for climbing, somewhere in ancient Africa, long before anyone can speak of people, before stone tools scatter across riverbanks, before firelight flickers against cave walls. A population of apes moves through a world that is no longer as stable as it once seems. The forest still stands, but it no longer stretches without interruption. Patches thin, corridors narrow, seasons become more uncertain, rainfall shifts. In some places the trees pull back just enough to expose new distances, new risks, and new opportunities. Nothing in this moment announces the future. Nothing declares that one lineage, among many, is beginning the long path toward becoming human. Yet this is where the mystery lives, not in a sudden leap, not in a single miraculous turning point, but in a landscape that starts to loosen the old rules. It is tempting to imagine a clean dividing line, as if one morning an ape wakes into a new kind of existence. But the real world does not move that way. Evolution never works like a switch thrown in the dark. It works through accumulated differences, through generations so numerous that no living mind could count them, through small advantages that barely look important when they first appear. What later becomes a defining trait often begins as something modest, even unremarkable, a slight shift in habit, posture, diet, or timing. The creature at the beginning of this story is not a half-finished person. It is not a clumsy rehearsal for humanity. It is an ape, fully suited to its own time, living in a world of predators, fruiting cycles, rival groups, storms, droughts, infants to protect, and distances to judge. Its life is immediate. Its future is invisible. That matters, because one of the most persistent misunderstandings about human origins is the idea that humans came from the apes people see today, as if chimpanzees or gorillas are unfinished versions of something completed elsewhere. What survives in the record suggests something both stranger and more humbling. Humans do not descend from modern apes. Humans and modern apes descend from common ancestors buried deep in time. Those ancestral populations are gone. Their bones are scarce. Their names, where science gives them names at all, are provisional markers pinned to a broken record. Scholars still debate the exact branching pattern, the timing of some splits, even the precise appearance of key ancestors. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad shape is clear enough. Somewhere among the apes of Africa, one branch begins to follow a different evolutionary route. Other branches lead, in time, to chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. One leads, slowly and unevenly, toward beings who will eventually ask where they came from. Seen from a distance, that branch is easy to describe. Seen up close, it is tangled. The late Miocene and early Pliocene are not simple backdrops but restless ages of environmental pressure. Tectonic uplift alters rainfall patterns. Global cooling changes vegetation. Forests do not simply vanish, but they become more fragmented in many regions, breaking into mosaics of woodland, river corridors, scrub, and more open ground, for animals adapted to continuous tree cover. This is not a minor inconvenience. It changes travel, foraging, exposure, and safety. It forces decisions again and again, though not conscious ones in the human sense. A group must move farther for food. A mother must carry an infant across a gap that did not exist for her ancestors. A male must watch the ground as carefully as the branches. A body designed for one pattern of life begins to encounter another. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the old world does not disappear all at once. That is one of the most important things to understand. The lineage that will someday be called human does not step cleanly out of the trees and abandon the forest behind. For a very long time, it belongs to both worlds and fully to neither. It still climbs, it still grips, it still sleeps with one eye on safety above the ground. Yet it is increasingly tested at the margins, in those unstable places where woodland opens and closes, where food is patchier, where movement on the ground begins to matter in new ways. In this setting, being slightly more flexible can matter more than being perfectly specialized. A creature able to exploit several environments, several foods, several strategies, can survive changes that defeat a narrower design. The great irony is that later human beings, with cities and writing and engines, often look back on this beginning as if intelligence alone explains it. But the first decisive pressures are probably not intellectual in the modern sense. They are ecological. They concern calories, weather, predators, infants, and energy. They concern whether a body can move far enough without overheating, whether it can carry food, whether it can scan the horizon, whether it can endure seasonal unpredictability. The mind that will one day paint caves and launch satellites begins here as part of a whole animal, inseparable from hips, shoulders, spine, teeth, gut, skin, and social dependence. There is no pure story of brain before body, or culture before climate. Everything is entangled from the start. Even the emotional atmosphere of this ancient world is worth pausing over, because it is easy to strip prehistory into bones and dates and lose the life inside it. These apes know fear, they know hunger, they know the urgency of protecting young, they know dominance and tension within groups, and whatever forms of attachment and recognition their social lives allow. Dawn brings risk. Night brings different risk. A rustle in dry grass means something. The absence of fruit in one grove means something. The smell of rain, the silence of birds, the signs left by other animals along a water source, these things press directly against survival. No one is inventing philosophy under the trees, but the ancient roots of alertness, memory, cooperation, and social reading are already there, serving immediate needs in bodies that are being quietly sorted by a changing world. This is also where the romance of a single accidental mutation begins to fade. Mutations certainly matter. Every lineage depends on genetic variation, and without mutation there is nothing new for selection to work on. But no single explanation fully accounts for the making of a human lineage. Evolution is not a lone spark in darkness that instantly transforms one creature into another. It is a layered process in which countless variations arise, most of them trivial, many of them lost, a few of them useful in ways that only become visible when the environment changes around them. Some traits persist because they help, some persist because they're linked to others, some spread slowly, some remain local. The story ahead will involve anatomy, behavior, climate, migration, diet, cooperation, and chance. Mutation is part of the mechanism, but not the mythic shortcut people often imagine. So the first scene in the long human story is not a march across open grassland beneath a heroic sky. It is something quieter and more uncertain. It is a fringe world of broken forests and exposed crossings. It is a branch lineage within a broader ape family, not yet distinct enough to deserve the confidence of hindsight, but already living under pressures that favour versatility over stability. Somewhere in these populations, generation after generation, selection begins to reward bodies and behaviours that can handle the edge spaces better than before. No observer is present to mark the threshold. No fossil captures the whole transformation. Time carries most of it away. What remains is fragmentary, a few teeth, a few bones, a few clues in ancient environments, and the undeniable fact that one ape lineage does not remain what it was. That's how the story opens, not with certainty, but with narrowing forests, widening ground, and an animal caught between old strengths and new demands. It is still an ape. It is not yet human. And in that long, unstable interval between the two lies one of the most consequential developments in the history of life. What follows from that unstable beginning is not the appearance of a recognizable human, but a deepening problem of identity. Once the old forest world begins to fragment and one branch of apes starts to live under slightly different pressures, the question becomes almost impossible to frame in ordinary language. What exactly is changing? At what point does an ape ancestor become something more specific than an ape? And what do scientists really mean when they say that humans evolved from ape ancestors? The answer is both straightforward and difficult. Humans are apes, not metaphorically, not loosely, but biologically. The human lineage does not stand outside the ape family looking in. It is one surviving twig on that family tree. The difference is that it is the twig that eventually acquires a peculiar kind of self-awareness, and then spends a great deal of time trying to place itself above the rest. That instinct to separate is ancient in its own way. People have long wanted a dramatic origin, a clean moment when the familiar animal world ends and the human story begins. But the deeper science goes, the less satisfying that kind of boundary becomes. There is no first creature that wakes up fully human in the way popular imagination prefers. There is no bright line painted across a single generation. Instead, there are populations, changing over immense spans of time, carrying mixtures of traits that would look confusing to anyone expecting a neat ladder. Some features appear early, others appear much later. A body may retain an ape-like shoulder while showing changes in the pelvis. Teeth may shift while the brain remains modest. Feet may begin to tell one story while hands still tell another. This is why the phrase apes became human is useful for a title. But scientifically, it is a compressed description of something much slower and far more tangled. The common ancestor shared by humans and the African apes of today is especially elusive. People often imagine it as a kind of chimpanzee standing at the base of the human line. But that is almost certainly wrong. Chimpanzees have been evolving for just as long as humans have. Gorillas have been evolving for just as long. Bonobos have been evolving for just as long. None of them are living fossils. None of them preserve the ancient starting point in pure form. What survives in the record suggests that the last common ancestor would likely look unfamiliar in ways that frustrate simple comparisons. It may share some features with chimpanzees, some with gorillas, some with neither. Its body, behaviour, and habitat remain partly hidden because the fossil record near the crucial split is thin, broken, and unevenly distributed across time and geography. That thinness matters more than most people realize. Fossils do not arrive as full biographies. They arrive as fragments, often damaged, often distorted, often separated from the soft tissues and behaviors that made the animal a living whole. A few teeth can survive where an entire skeleton vanishes. A jaw may persist while feet, hands, and spine disappear. Sediment may preserve one landscape and erase another. Forest environments, where many of these early apes and hominins likely lived, are not always kind to fossilization. Bones in such settings are scavenged, weathered, scattered, dissolved, or buried in ways that leave only partial traces. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a minor inconvenience. It shapes the entire argument. Much of paleoanthropology is an effort to reconstruct entire ways of life from remnants small enough to fit in a hand. Even so, a few names emerge from the darkness. Sahelanthropus, known from Chad, is one of the most provocative. Its skull is ancient enough to sit close to the probable time of the split between the human line and the line leading to chimpanzees. The face is short in a way that caught early attention, and the position of the foramen magnum, the opening where the spinal cord enters the skull, has been read by some researchers as a hint of more upright posture. Yet scholars still debate what exactly Sahelanthropus was, how it moved, and where it belongs on the family tree. Orrorin, from Kenya, and Ardipithecus, especially Ardipithecus ramidus from Ethiopia, add more pieces and more uncertainty. Ardipithecus is particularly revealing because it resists the old picture of a simple, chimp-like starting point. Its anatomy suggests a creature adapted to both climbing and some form of upright movement, living in woodland rather than open savanna alone. That detail was quietly revolutionary. It suggested that key steps toward the human line may have unfolded in more varied habitats than older textbook stories allowed. The lesser-known surprise here is not just that the evidence is fragmentary, but that some of the most important fragments tell scientists what early ancestors were not. They were not merely knuckle-walking chimpanzees beginning to stand up. In fact, one of the enduring debates is whether the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees even moved like either species does today. Modern chimpanzee knuckle-walking may be a specialized development of its own, not a perfect window into the ancestral condition. If that is true, then one of the most famous mental shortcuts in human origins collapses. The starting point is not a present-day ape frozen in time. It is a lost form, part familiar, part strange, and largely unrecoverable except through hints. This is why fossil interpretation is both rigorous and humbling. A pelvis can suggest one pattern of locomotion, but without the full spine and foot the picture remains provisional. Tooth enamel can suggest diet, but diet alone does not tell the whole story of behavior or social structure. Skull shape can hint at muscle attachment, posture, or development, but cannot reveal thought in any direct sense. No single explanation fully accounts for the shift from ancient ape populations to later hominins, because the record is not arranged to satisfy human curiosity. It is arranged by chance, geology, burial, erosion, and survival. The result is a chronicle with missing chapters, torn pages, and recurring debates over how to place the surviving lines in order. And yet, for all the gaps, something firm begins to emerge. Scientists use the word hominin for the branch more closely related to humans than to chimpanzees. That branch includes modern humans and extinct relatives after the split from our last shared ancestor with chimpanzees. The moment that branch exists, the story is no longer about apes in general. It is about one particular lineage of apes beginning to drift into distinctive territory. At first, the difference may be subtle enough that only bones can reveal it, but subtle does not mean insignificant. Small changes in posture, locomotion, dentition, or developmental timing can open entirely new, evolutionary possibilities. There is also a deeper emotional consequence to this view. Once humans are placed inside the ape family instead of above it, the old story of exceptional separation becomes harder to maintain. The face in the mirror is not the product of escape from nature, but of prolonged entanglement with it. Human beings retain the old inheritance everywhere in grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, expressive faces, long childhoods, social dependence, flexible behavior, and the powerful mental reading of other minds that begins as a survival skill in social primates. What changes over time is not that the ape disappears, but that one ape lineage becomes increasingly peculiar in the way it moves, makes, remembers, and eventually imagines. So before humans have a name, before the genus Homo appears, before language leaves any shadow in the archaeological record, the foundations are already being laid in bodies that are still close enough to the wider ape world to remind us how recent the difference truly is. The fossil record cannot give a complete portrait of that beginning. It cannot show fur colour, vocal tone, or the full texture of social life. It cannot tell us what an infant sounded like in its mother's arms, or exactly how a group moved through evening woodland at the edge of rain. But what survives in the record suggests a lineage still deeply ape-like, increasingly unusual, and already carrying the first signs of a future no creature in that age could have imagined. The world that shapes this early branch does not change in a single direction, and that is part of what makes it so important. It is not a simple tale of endless forest giving way to endless grassland. As older illustrations once preferred to show, ancient Africa is more complicated than that, restless in both climate and geography, shifting across long cycles that alternately open and close possibilities. Rainfall patterns move, temperatures fluctuate, river systems alter their courses, woodlands retreat in some regions and persist in others. Open country expands, but not uniformly, not permanently, and not all at once. What emerges over immense spans of time is not one new habitat replacing one old habitat, but a patchwork world, a mosaic of forest edges, broken woodland, brush, floodplain, lakeshore, and grassier stretches that require a different kind of survival. For the ape lineages living through these changes, the challenge is not merely to endure a harsher environment, it is to endure unpredictability itself. That may sound like a subtle distinction, but it matters. Animals can become highly specialized for stable conditions. They can thrive brilliantly in worlds that remain consistent enough for their bodies and behaviors to match the same rhythms over thousands of generations. A changing world rewards something different. It favors flexibility, range, tolerance, and the ability to exploit opportunities that appear briefly and then vanish again. A fruit source that once returned reliably may fail in a drier year. A shaded route between feeding areas may break apart. A water source may shrink seasonally, drawing prey and predators together into tighter spaces. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single climatic shift fully accounts for human evolution. But what survives in the geological and paleo-environmental records suggests repeated instability rather than one clean ecological handoff. That instability may be one of the great hidden engines of the story. The land itself contributes to the pressure. East Africa in particular is shaped by tectonic movement, uplift, volcanism, and the slow creation of basins and highlands that alter local climates in complicated ways. Lakes form and disappear, valleys deepen, rain shadows develop. Some areas become more seasonal, others remain refugees of thicker vegetation. This means that two populations, not all that far apart on a map, may live under meaningfully different ecological conditions. One group may still find relative security in woodland cover, another may face longer crossings over exposed ground, another may live near ecotones, those threshold environments where different habitats meet and where survival often depends on opportunism. These are the kinds of settings where selection can begin to favour creatures not perfectly built for one world, but capable enough in several. In such places, movement becomes more consequential. Not heroic movement, not migrations in the grand later sense, but ordinary movement how far food lies from safety, how infants are carried, how bodies cool in sun, how often a group must descend from trees, how quickly danger can be seen, how efficiently scattered resources can be gathered. The old arboreal inheritance remains valuable. Climbing still saves lives. Height still offers protection. Branches still provide food and refuge. Yet ground travel matters more often than before. Even intermittent pressure of that kind can shape anatomy over long spans. The point is not that forests disappear and force apes onto plains. The point is that mixed environments repeatedly reward those who can negotiate both. Diet is changing too, though not in any dramatic human sense yet. Early members of the hominin line are not suddenly hunters dominating landscapes. They remain small-bodied primates working within ecological limits. But a more variable environment encourages broader feeding strategies. When dependable foods become patchier, fallback foods gain importance. Tougher plant materials, underground storage organs, seeds, insects, carrion, or scattered seasonal resources may matter more in bad times than abundant fruits do in good times. Teeth, jaws, and chewing patterns begin to register these pressures. Some later hominin species will become heavily specialized for powerful chewing, while others appear to maintain more flexible dietary strategies. Scholars still debate exactly how different species partitioned food sources and how much local variation mattered, but the larger pattern is suggestive. Environmental instability does not merely shape where bodies move. It shapes what bodies need to process. This has social consequences as well. It is easy to think of evolution as a story written into skeletons alone, but behavior can become a selective force when conditions grow less predictable. Group cohesion, vigilance, tolerance, communication, and cooperative care may all become more valuable when resources are variable and risk is harder to anticipate. A lineage living in more open or mixed settings may need to monitor danger differently, coordinate movement differently, and adjust its daily rhythms around exposure, heat, and access to food. None of this requires language in the modern sense. None of it requires culture in its later symbolic richness. But it does suggest that the social intelligence inherited from ape ancestors is operating in environments that increasingly reward coordination under stress. A lesser-known detail, and an important one, is that climate instability may have done more than favour specific traits. It may have favoured evolvability itself, the value of remaining adaptable in bodies and behaviours rather than becoming too narrowly committed too soon. In a stable habitat, one excellent solution can dominate. In a variable habitat, the better long-term solution may be not perfection, but resilience. That kind of pressure does not point neatly toward humanity in hindsight. It does not guarantee brains, tools, or fire. It simply helps explain why lineages capable of experimenting in anatomical and behavioral terms might persist while others vanish. Evolution in such conditions looks less like a march and more like repeated testing. The emotional texture of these landscapes changes with the seasons. Dry months open the earth, exposing dust, pale grass, and hard ground where tracks linger briefly before wind and heat erase them. Wet months transform low areas into mud, reeds, insects, and temporary abundance. Woodland edges can feel rich at dawn and dangerous by afternoon. Night sounds travel differently in open country. A carcass means opportunity but also risk. Water draws life together and strips away distance between hunter and hunted. The ancient ape groups living here do not experience environmental change as an abstract process. They experience it as uncertainty in the next day's feeding, the next season's survival, the next safe route through exposed ground. This is why the older savanna-only explanation for human origins, though influential for decades, no longer seems sufficient on its own. The evidence suggests a more nuanced world in which woodland remains important, open habitats matter, and transitions between them may be especially significant. Upright walking, for example, may not originate simply as a response to endless grassland. It may emerge in more mixed settings where climbing, carrying, scanning, and energy-efficient travel all play roles. Diet broadens not because one resource disappears forever, but because reliability weakens and flexibility becomes valuable. Social habits deepen not because evolution plans a future human society, but because uncertainty punishes the isolated and rewards the group. No single explanation fully accounts for this period because climate, anatomy, and behavior interact across scales that do not line up neatly. Local conditions differ. Species overlap. Some populations may become more specialized, others more generalist. Some experiments fail. Some leave descendants. The record we have is biased toward what fossilizes and what researchers happen to find. Yet beneath those limitations a persuasive pattern remains. The human line does not arise in a world of calm abundance. It is forged in landscapes that keep shifting their terms. And this may be the deepest significance of the changing African world. It does not create humanity by design, but it repeatedly destabilizes the old balance. It loosens the grip of familiar routines. It turns certainty into risk. It places an ape lineage in habitats where versatility is tested again and again, where the body can no longer rely only on what once worked best in continuous forest, and where even slight advantages in posture, movement, feeding, and cooperation can accumulate. The lineage remains small, vulnerable, and deeply tied to its primate inheritance, but the conditions around it are beginning to favor something new, not all at once, not everywhere, and not yet recognizably human. The ground is changing before the walker does, and that is often how evolution begins. Long before the human brain becomes large enough to dominate the story, the body begins making a quieter adjustment, and it does so in fragments. That is one of the strangest features of human origins. If someone were designing the sequence from scratch, intelligence would seem like the obvious starting point. A larger brain would come first, then tools, then language, then perhaps a new way of moving through the world. But the fossil record suggests almost the reverse. The first great shift is not a leap in thought, but a rearrangement of balance. It appears in the hips, the legs, the spine, the base of the skull, and above all in the long, awkward question of what it means for an ape body to spend more time upright. At first, this change is easy to underestimate because it does not announce itself with drama. early bipedalism is not a polished modern stride crossing open plains with effortless confidence. It is partial, experimental, and probably inconsistent. The creatures involved are still climbers. Their arms still matter. Their hands still grip. Their feet, in some cases, retain features that make sense in a world where branches remain part of daily life. Yet something important is happening. Bodies are beginning to accommodate upright walking often enough for natural selection to notice, over immense spans of time, that matters more than any single moment of standing tall. Ardipithecus is one of the best reminders of how untidy this stage truly is. Its skeleton does not belong to a creature that has abandoned the trees, nor does it fit neatly into older stories about a chimp-like ancestor stepping onto open ground. Ardipithecus ramidus, from Ethiopia, shows a mosaic of traits that only make sense if the lineage is already experimenting with upright movement, while still retaining strong climbing abilities. The pelvis suggests some capacity for bipedality. The foot retains a grasping big toe that would be poorly suited to long-distance modern walking. This is not a failed human. It is not an incomplete version of later Homo. It is a creature living in a mixed world with a mixed body. And that mixture may be exactly the point. Evolution does not wait for perfect solutions before moving forward. It works through workable ones. Later, in Australopithecus, the evidence for habitual bipedalism becomes clearer. The pelvis narrows and reshapes. The femur angles inward toward the knee, helping place the foot under the body during walking. The lower limb begins to carry weight in a more consistently upright way. The spine and skull base also tell part of the story, reflecting a body that is balancing the head differently above the torso. Yet even here the picture is not fully modern. Australopithecines still retain upper body features that suggest climbing remains important. They are not simply small humans with ape heads. They are hominins, already committed enough to bipedality to distinguish themselves, but still close enough to their arboreal past to show where they came from. The famous footprints at Litoli in Tanzania make this shift feel briefly tangible. Preserved in volcanic ash nearly 3.7 million years ago, they show beings walking upright across damp ground, their weight passing through feet in a manner strikingly familiar. That familiarity can be unsettling. There is something intimate about footprints in a way even skeletons do not quite capture. Bones tell structure, footprints tell motion. They preserve not just anatomy but an instant of behaviour, a crossing, a pace, a direction. What survives in the record suggests that by this time, upright walking is not a rare accident. It is part of ordinary life. The walkers are still not human in the later sense, but their path across the ash looks uncannily close to something known. Why does this happen so early? Scholars still debate the relative importance of different explanations, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. Older theories often emphasized open savannas alone, imagining bipedalism as the obvious answer to a treeless world. But the evidence points to more varied environments, and with that variation comes a broader set of possibilities. Walking upright may help with energy-efficient travel between scattered food sources. It may free the hands for carrying food, infants, or objects. It may improve visibility over tall grasses or low scrub in certain settings. It may reduce the body's exposure to direct overhead sun while increasing airflow. It may prove useful in woodland feeding as well, allowing individuals to reach, balance, or move through branches and ground space in flexible ways. Some researchers have even argued that standing upright briefly to gather or display could have provided behavioral advantages long before full habitual bipedality took hold. None of these ideas alone seem sufficient. Together they suggest a trait with multiple uses emerging in a shifting ecological mosaic. The important point is that upright walking does not need a single grand purpose at the beginning. It only needs to be helpful often enough, in enough situations, for selection to preserve and refine it. That is how many major evolutionary changes begin. A posture that starts as context-dependent becomes more frequent. A slight skeletal adjustment improves efficiency. A lineage with even modest advantages in travel or carrying leaves more offspring under certain conditions. Over time, what was once occasional becomes ordinary, and the body, generation by generation, begins to rebuild itself around that new ordinary. This rebuilding comes with costs. Bipedalism is not a free gift. It reshapes the entire frame. The spine must balance new stresses. The pelvis must do new work. Birth will eventually become more complicated as walking efficiency and large-brained infants pull the body in different directions. Knees and lower backs will carry burdens unknown to four-limbed posture. Even in the present, the human body still carries evidence that its design is not perfectly engineered, but historically assembled. A bad back, a vulnerable knee, the pain of childbirth. These are not random flaws. They are part of the long compromise written into a primate skeleton, adapted for one way of life and gradually repurposed for another. That compromise is one reason the change matters so much. Bipedalism is not merely another trait added to a list. It alters the entire relationship between body and environment. Hands become less tied to locomotion. Carrying becomes easier. The visual field changes. Movement over distance can become more economical under certain conditions. The torso, shoulders, and hips begin to participate in new patterns of coordination. A creature that can move upright habitually is not just walking differently. It is beginning to inhabit space differently. And yet the irony remains that all of this happens before the feature most people associate with humanity has fully arrived. The brains of early Australopithecines remain small compared with later Homo, closer in size to those of chimpanzees than to modern humans. Whatever mental changes are underway, they have not yet produced the dramatic cerebral expansion that popular imagination expects. That means bipedalism cannot be explained as the consequence of already being intelligent in a recognizably human way. Instead, the body changes first, and the later story of tools, energy, childhood, memory, and culture unfolds in the world that upright bodies help create. This is easy to miss because hindsight makes everything look coordinated. It is tempting to see early bipedalism as if evolution already knows where it's going. But nothing in the process requires foresight. An ape lineage does not stand up in order to become human. It stands, more often and more effectively, because under the conditions of its world that posture begins to pay, the future arrives later. What begins here is simpler and more profound, a shift in posture that changes what the hands can do, what distance feels like, how food and young are carried, how landscapes are crossed, and how the rest of the body will eventually be reorganized. So the first unmistakable step toward humanity is not a word, not a tool, not a fire, and not a thought anyone could call fully human. It is a gate. It is a balancing act practiced for millions of years by bodies that still belong partly to the trees and partly to the ground. It is awkward before it is elegant, costly before it is transformative, and ancient before anyone recognizes its consequence. But once that step becomes habitual, the lineage is no longer merely adjusting to a changing world. It is beginning to change the terms on which it can live within it. Once the body spends more of its life upright, the hands begin to live under new conditions. They are still the hands of an ape lineage, descended from climbers, shaped by millions of years of grasping branches, stabilizing weight, pulling the body upward, and negotiating three-dimensional space in the canopy. But as locomotion shifts, even imperfectly, the role of the upper limb begins to loosen. A hand no longer has to do quite as much of the old work with every movement. It is not released all at once, and it does not become human overnight. Yet the change is profound. A structure once deeply entangled with getting the body from place to place now has more opportunity to carry, hold, sort, strike, cradle, and eventually shape. That sounds simple, but it depends on a whole chain of anatomical compromises. The shoulder matters, the arm matters, the wrist matters. The hand itself matters down to the proportions of the fingers and the mechanics of the thumb. In a climbing ape, long curved fingers are invaluable. They wrap branches securely, they distribute force, they allow hanging, pulling, and suspending body weight in ways a straighter human hand does poorly. Early hominins retain much of that inheritance for a long time. Their fingers do not abruptly straighten into modern form the moment bipedalism appears. Their upper bodies still show the old world in their bones, yet over time, as life on the ground becomes more regular and the hands are less constantly recruited for locomotion, different demands begin to matter more. Carrying is one of the most overlooked of those demands. An upright creature can transport things in a way a quadrupedal one cannot easily match. Food can be taken from one place to another instead of being consumed where it is found. Infants can be held more securely while moving over uneven ground. Objects can travel back toward shelter, shade, or companions. This sounds almost ordinary, and perhaps that is why it is so easy to underestimate. But in evolutionary terms, it may be quietly transformative. A lineage that can bring resources to others changes the possibilities of cooperation. A mother can move and hold. A male can carry provisions or object across distance. A group can begin to center activity around places rather than moments. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is difficult to know how much early carrying shaped social life before later Homo. But what survives in anatomy and behavior suggests that freed hands enlarge the practical world long before they produce anything that looks like advanced technology. The hand itself changes by degrees. In later hominins, and especially within Homo, the thumb becomes more robust relative to the fingers. The joints and wrist reflect greater stability for precision handling, and the architecture of the hand increasingly supports powerful grips combined with finer control. Modern human hands are unusual because they balance strength and delicacy in the same structure. They can swing a hammer stone, but they can also pinch, scrape, rotate, thread, and guide with remarkable sensitivity. That combination does not appear all at once, and scholars still debate exactly when the crucial functional thresholds are crossed. Some Australopithecines may already possess hands capable of more refined manipulation than older assumptions allowed. Certain fossils hint at surprising dexterity earlier than once thought, suggesting that the capacity for precise handling may begin accumulating before the archaeological record clearly shows regular tool manufacture. This matters because bones often reveal capacity before behavior leaves durable traces. A hand can be capable of more than the ground happens to preserve. Organic tools vanish. Simple manipulations disappear without a trace. A stone intentionally struck may survive for millions of years. A sharpened stick, woven fibre, or carried bundle almost never does. One of the lesser-known frustrations in reconstructing early human behavior is that the archaeological record is biased toward what lasts, not necessarily toward what mattered most in daily life. for all anyone knows. Early hominins may have been handling plant materials, digging implements, or perishable objects in ways that were already behaviourally significant, long before stone artefacts become common in the record. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of manual skill because the evidence is filtered through preservation, and preservation is mercilessly selective. The shoulder tells part of this story too. Human shoulders are extraordinary in ways that are easy to miss because they belong to us. Compared with other apes, the human upper body eventually becomes better suited to a wide range of controlled arm movements, including repeated throwing, forceful striking, and fine repositioning in front of the body. Some of those capacities are later developments, tied more strongly to Homo than to earlier hominins. But the path toward them begins once the arms are less dominated by locomotor demands. A shoulder that no longer exists primarily to haul body weight through branches becomes available for other tasks. This does not mean climbing disappears. Far from it. For millions of years, the upper body still carries traces of arboreal life, but the balance is shifting. The arm is becoming less exclusively a climbing instrument and more of a manipulative one. There is also a subtler transformation in timing and attention. A creature that uses its hands more variably must devote more nervous system energy to coordination, pressure, sequence, and anticipation. That does not yet mean abstract thought in the later human sense. It means the body is beginning to live through more layered interactions with objects. To hold a stone and strike another stone in a useful way, even occasionally, requires force control. To carry food while scanning for danger requires coordination between posture, vision, and grip. To strip material, probe a crevice, or use one object against another builds loops between hand and brain that reward memory and repetition. The world is no longer only something moved through. It is increasingly something handled. Modern apes, of course, handle objects too. They use sticks, stones, leaves, and improvised tools in impressive ways. And that continuity matters. Human uniqueness does not emerge from a blank slate. It emerges from a primate inheritance already rich in curiosity, object play, social learning, and problem solving. Chimpanzees crack nuts, fish for insects, and modify simple implements. Orangutans and capuchins also show striking manipulative intelligence. The difference is not that non-human apes have hands while humans have tools. The difference lies in the intensity, accumulation, teaching, and eventual cultural dependence of those behaviors. What begins in the hominin line is not the invention of manipulation itself, but the slow reorganization of body and behavior that allows manipulation to become central. This is where the hand becomes more than an anatomical detail. It becomes a meeting point between posture and possibility. Once hands are freer, the consequences radiate outward. Carrying links movement to sharing. Gripping links strength to experimentation. Touch links the outside world to memory. Repeated manipulation encourages selection for structures that make manipulation more efficient, and those improved structures in turn widen the range of useful actions. Evolution often works through these feedback loops. A small increase in manual control supports new behaviors. New behaviors reward better manual control. Over time, the loop deepens until the lineage is doing things its ancestors could not have sustained or refined in the same way. Still, caution matters. It would be easy to romanticize this phase as the triumphant liberation of the hand, but that language hides the reality of compromise. Early hominin hands remain burdened by old inheritance and new demands alike. They're not perfect instruments waiting to make civilization. They are transitional structures, useful in several worlds, excellent in none. They must still help with climbing, still absorb stress, still serve an animal whose life is dominated by survival rather than invention. Yet that is precisely why they matter. Evolution does not require perfection to build something consequential. It only requires a change in emphasis, a reweighting of effort, a body spending enough time in enough new situations for different abilities to become worth preserving. And so the hand, once chiefly a partner in motion through branches, begins its long transformation into something else: a carrier, a holder, a striker, a shaper, a recorder of pressure and texture, a bridge between intention and matter. It is still early. Stoneworking on a large scale lies ahead. The great cultural explosion lies far ahead. But the groundwork is already being laid in shoulders no longer wholly committed to climbing, in thumbs gradually gaining leverage, in wrists stabilizing under new stresses, and in fingers learning generation by generation to do more than hold on. As the hands become more available to act on the world, another change begins to gather force more slowly, and in some ways more expensively. It happens inside the skull, but it is never only about the skull. The enlargement of the human brain is often treated as the central drama of our origins, the master key that unlocks everything else. Yet even here the truth is less abrupt and less heroic than popular memory prefers. The brain does not suddenly swell into brilliance. It grows by stages, unevenly, across different species and over vast stretches of time. And every increase comes with costs that ripple through the whole body and the whole life cycle. A larger brain demands energy. It demands time. It demands social investment. It demands a longer period of helplessness after birth and a longer apprenticeship before adulthood. Intelligence, in this sense, does not arrive as a gift. It arrives as a burden a lineage must learn how to carry. That burden begins before brains become truly large. Even early hominins with brain sizes still close to those of chimpanzees are not mentally static. The issue is not simply volume, but organization, developmental timing, and the growing importance of learned behavior within a social world. A primate lineage already comes equipped with powerful cognitive foundations, memory for places, awareness of hierarchy, reading of faces and gestures, sensitivity to alliances, flexible feeding strategies, and the ability to learn by watching others. These are not small things. They are the scaffolding on which later human cognition is built. What changes over time is not that intelligence appears from nowhere, but that the balance shifts. Learning matters more, memory matters more, group life becomes more consequential, childhood stretches, the young spend more time depending on others, and that prolonged dependence becomes one of the strangest and most defining features of the human line. In most mammals, infancy is a race against vulnerability. The young must grow quickly enough to survive and become functional within the demands of their environment. Primates already bend that rule by investing heavily in fewer offspring, giving them time to learn the social and ecological map of their world. The human lineage bends it further. A longer childhood is costly in the most obvious way. It means years of feeding, protection, carrying, supervision, and tolerance before the young can fully support themselves. For any species living under predation, climatic instability, and recurring scarcity, this looks almost reckless. Yet what survives in the record suggests that delayed maturation and extended learning eventually becomes central to the human strategy. The young are not slow because evolution has made a mistake. They are slow because the lineage is becoming increasingly dependent on experience, That dependence changes family life, group structure, and the rhythm of survival. A species with vulnerable young for many years cannot rely on isolated mothers alone. Even before later human society takes recognizable shape, selection likely begins to reward forms of cooperation that make extended development possible. Shared vigilance, food transfer, tolerance toward juveniles, and social learning all grow in importance when a youngster needs years, not months, to acquire the habits necessary for survival. Scholars still debate how far these patterns reach in the earliest hominins and exactly when the most human-like developmental schedules appear. But the general direction is clear. Bigger and more complex brains do not just create smarter adults, they create longer childhoods, deeper dependency, and stronger pressure for social systems that can sustain both. This is where memory becomes more than a useful trait. In a variable environment, memory can be the difference between endurance and failure. To remember where water lingers late into the dry season, where fruiting trees can still be found after a poor year, where predators tend to wait, where shelter lies in sudden weather. These are not luxuries. They are survival tools. A longer-lived, more socially entangled primate lineage gains an advantage from individuals who can store and use increasingly complex information. The world is no longer just reacted to in the moment. It begins to exist across time inside the mind. Paths can be remembered, seasons can be anticipated, places can be revisited, social obligations can be carried forward, injuries, dangers, and opportunities can remain present after they disappear from sight. That does not yet mean narrative thought in the full human sense, but it suggests a mind becoming more temporally layered. Many animals remember. Many primates remember especially well. The important change is the degree to which memory becomes central to a way of life built on flexibility, delayed development, and repeated learning. A young hominin does not merely inherit a body, it inherits a world of habits, roots, tolerances, and techniques that must be absorbed over time. That makes elders more valuable too. An older individual who has survived multiple seasons carries more than genes. It carries information. In a lineage where experience matters, age becomes a cognitive resource. The increase in brain size that becomes especially visible later in the genus Homo intensifies all of this. Compared with earlier Australopithecines, Homo species show a broader shift toward larger brains. Though even this growth is not linear or identical across branches. Some species expand dramatically, others plateau. Some combine larger brains with bodies adapted to long-distance movement and wider ecological range. The old image of a steady upward staircase no longer works well. No single explanation fully accounts for why brain expansion occurs where it does, and when it does. Diet matters, especially access to more energy-dense foods. Social complexity matters. Tool use matters. Environmental unpredictability matters. Developmental changes matter. It is likely that the brain grows within a web of feedback loops rather than in response to one isolated cause. Energy is the hard fact beneath the romance. Brain tissue is expensive. In modern humans, the brain consumes a striking share of the body's energy budget, especially during childhood. A lineage cannot support larger brains without paying for them somewhere, whether through dietary improvements, reduced gut costs, cooperative provisioning, altered developmental schedules, or some combination of all of these. This is one reason the story of intelligence cannot be separated from the story of food, fire, hands, and social life. The brain is not a floating miracle in the skull. It is fed by labor, by foraging, by shared effort, by the ability of a group to keep helpless young alive long enough for their nervous systems to become useful. And with that comes a peculiar paradox. The smarter the lineage becomes, the more helpless its infants tend to be. Human babies are astonishingly unfinished compared with the newborns of many other mammals. This unfinished state is partly a consequence of the compromises imposed by bipedalism and pelvic anatomy, and partly a developmental strategy that allows the brain to continue growing rapidly after birth. The result is a species in which the most cognitively capable adults are produced by some of the most dependent young. That dependence is not a side effect, it is built into the system. A long childhood becomes the price of a mind that can absorb language, social nuance, tools, norms, and complex environmental knowledge. There is a quieter change within this as well, one harder to fossilize. As learning deepens, behavior becomes less strictly locked to instinct and more open to local variation. Two groups of the same species may not do everything the same way. Slight differences in foraging habits, object use, movement patterns, or social tolerances can persist because young individuals learn from those around them. This is the beginning of culture in its broadest and least glamorous sense. Not art or myth yet, but shared practice carried through imitation and repetition. The evidence remains incomplete, because behavior is always harder to preserve than bone. But what survives in anatomy and archaeology suggests a lineage increasingly dependent on what can be taught, as well as what is inherited. So the growing brain does not arrive like a crown placed on an already finished creature. It grows from older primate capacities and pulls the rest of the life cycle behind it. It lengthens childhood. It deepens memory. It raises the value of cooperation. It makes age more useful, infants more vulnerable, learning more essential, and social life more costly and more rewarding. By the time these changes have gathered enough force to define later human evolution, the lineage is no longer simply surviving through anatomy alone. It is surviving through stored experience, prolonged development, and minds that take longer to build precisely because they can hold more of the world once they are formed. By the time the body is walking more often on two legs, the hands are doing different work, and the young are taking longer to learn the world around them. The old fantasy of a single accidental mutation has become harder to sustain. It is a powerful fantasy because it offers a clean answer to a messy question. It suggests that somewhere in deep time, one random genetic event transformed an ordinary ape into the first human, as if evolution were waiting for one lucky error to unlock the future. The appeal of that idea is obvious. It is simple. It is dramatic. It gives the entire human story a single hinge on which to turn. But almost everything science has uncovered about evolution argues against such neatness. Mutations matter enormously. Without mutation there is no variation, and without variation there is nothing for natural selection, drift, or changing environments to work on. Yet no single mutation can explain the making of a human lineage. What emerges instead is something slower, broader, and in some ways more astonishing, a long accumulation of genetic changes, most of them small, interacting with bodies, behaviors, climates, and developmental systems across millions of years. At the most basic level, mutation is not an event reserved for dramatic evolutionary turning points. It is constant. DNA is copied generation after generation, and copying is never perfectly exact. Most mutations are neutral or nearly neutral. Some are harmful and disappear quickly. A few prove useful in particular conditions. Many do nothing visible at all, at least not by themselves. This means that every population of every species is always carrying a shifting cloud of genetic variation. Evolution does not wait for a miracle. It works with whatever differences are already present and whatever new ones arise. In a stable environment, many changes may remain minor. In a changing one, traits that were previously irrelevant can suddenly matter. That is especially important in the human story because so many of the traits involved are not controlled by one gene acting alone. Walking upright is not the product of one mutation. A larger and differently organized brain is not the product of one mutation. Changes in tooth size, jaw structure, pelvic form, hand function, developmental timing, skin physiology, metabolism, and social behavior do not reduce to one switch. They emerge through networks of genes affecting growth, tissue formation, hormone systems, neural wiring, and the timing of development. Some of these genes influence multiple traits at once. Some act early in development, where small shifts in timing can have large downstream consequences. Some alter not the structure of a protein, but when, where, and how strongly a gene is expressed. In many cases, regulation matters as much as raw genetic code. That point is easy to miss because popular culture still imagines genes as isolated instructions with straightforward outcomes. One gene for one trait, one mutation for one dramatic change. Biology is rarely so tidy. A gene may contribute to bone growth in one context and neural development in another. A regulatory change may alter the shape of a jaw not by inventing a new structure, but by extending or shortening a growth period already present in ancestral forms. Developmental systems are deeply interconnected. Change one part of the timing, and the whole trajectory can shift. This is one reason scholars often speak of human evolution as mosaic. Different features change at different rates, in different combinations, under different pressures. The body does not transform as a single coordinated package. It comes apart and reassembles over time in pieces. There are, of course, real genes that have attracted attention because they seem relevant to later human traits. FOXP2 is often mentioned in discussions of speech and language. Though early popular accounts exaggerated its meaning, it is not a language gene in any simple sense. It plays a role in neural and motor systems involved in complex vocal and sequential control, and versions of it are found across many animals. Likewise, genes affecting brain development, skin, metabolism, immunity, or skeletal growth have all been studied for their part in human evolution. But even here, caution is essential. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for traits as complex as language, cognition, or social behavior. Evolution rarely hands over a neat genetic culprit for a large historical transformation. What seems more likely is that human evolution depends heavily on cumulative changes in regulation and development. A slight shift in how long a juvenile body grows before maturing can alter body proportions. A shift in cranial development can affect braincase shape and facial projection. A shift in muscle attachment or bone growth can change chewing, posture, or locomotion. Over time, these changes can interact in ways that natural selection either preserves or removes. The process is not linear. Some mutations may be useful only in a certain environmental setting. Some may have costs as well as benefits. Some may spread simply because populations are small and drift carries them forward. Others may remain rare until ecology changes around them. Evolution, in that sense, is neither pure accident nor pure design. Mutation supplies chance, selection filters it, environment gives it context. History determines what combinations are available at any given moment. This is where the word accidental needs careful handling. Mutations arise without foresight. They do not happen because a lineage needs them. In that sense, they are accidental. But once variation exists, the survival and spread of that variation is not random in the same way. A body slightly better able to travel between scattered resources may leave more offspring in a variable habitat. A developmental pattern that supports longer learning may prove advantageous in a socially complex lineage. A physiological change that helps cope with heat, diet, or disease may matter profoundly under certain conditions and not at all under others. So the accident lies in the arrival of variation, not in the larger pattern by which successful variation accumulates. One lesser-known detail makes the story even more complicated. Human evolution is shaped not only by new mutations arising in isolation, but also by old genetic variation carried forward for long periods, reshuffled and reweighted in changing populations. In some cases, the ingredients for future adaptation may already be present in ancestral groups, long before they become especially useful. Selection can act on standing variation, not merely on fresh mutations. That means major evolutionary shifts do not always require waiting for a brand new genetic change. Sometimes they involve new environments exposing the value of traits already quietly circulating in a population. And then there is the role of culture, which eventually begins feeding back into biology. This process becomes especially visible later, with examples such as lactase persistence in certain populations or genetic adaptations linked to diet, disease, and altitude. But the deeper principle may extend much further back. Once behavior changes the environment in which bodies live, biology and culture stop moving independently. Tool use changes food access. Fire changes digestion and energy budgets. Social learning changes survival. Cooperative care changes which infants live long enough to reproduce. In this sense, human evolution is not just genes shaping bodies. It is genes, bodies, behavior, and environment repeatedly altering one another. The old single mutation myth also flattens time in a misleading way. Human evolution is not fast in the way human stories prefer. It is patient beyond imagination, a change that seems dramatic from the perspective of modern anatomy may have taken hundreds of thousands of years to spread, intensify, or combine with other changes. Whole populations may carry transitional forms for vast spans of time. Some lineages may experiment with traits that later disappear. Others may preserve features long after new ones emerge elsewhere. The family tree is crowded with branches that do not lead directly to us, each carrying its own mixture of inherited and novel traits. There is no single doorway through which evolution passes. There are thresholds everywhere. So when people ask whether humans were created by one accidental mutation, the closest honest answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the limited sense that mutation is always part of the raw material. Every major evolutionary transition depends on countless genetic changes arising without foresight. But no, in the sense that no solitary accident explains the transformation. Humanity is not the result of one error in copying DNA. It is the result of innumerable variations filtered through unstable climates, difficult landscapes, prolonged childhoods, changing diets, social dependence, and bodies already being reshaped by upright movement and manual skill. That answer may feel less satisfying than a single dramatic cause. It offers no neat moment of creation. It gives no secret switch hidden in a chromosome. Yet it reveals something richer. The human line emerges not because one mutation suddenly abolishes the ape, but because an ape lineage carries forward enough useful change for long enough, under the right pressures, to become something increasingly strange. The accident is real, but it is only the beginning. What matters just as much is everything that history does with it afterward. As these genetic changes accumulate and selection keeps sorting which bodies can endure a changing world, the evidence begins to show up not only in posture and locomotion, but in the face itself. This is where the human story becomes almost unsettlingly visible. A pelvis or femur can tell specialists that something important has changed, but a face reaches closer to instinct. Jaws shrink or strengthen. Teeth alter in size and proportion. Brow ridges rise or soften. The muzzle-like projection seen in earlier apes begins, in some lineages, to pull back. The skull reorganizes itself around chewing, breathing, balance, and eventually the expanding brain. No single feature makes a face human. It is the cumulative effect of many small adjustments, some driven by diet, some by development, some by the architecture of the growing skull, and some by pressures that remain debated. What emerges is not a sudden revelation, but a slow undoing of the ancient ape profile. Teeth are among the clearest places to begin because they preserve so well, and because they respond so directly to the realities of survival. In earlier apes, the canine teeth, especially in males, often carry social significance as much as dietary function. They can be used in display, threat, and competition. In the hominin line, canine size is reduced compared with many earlier ape relatives, and over time the tooth row and jaw begin to tell a different story. This shift may reflect changes in feeding strategy, changes in social signaling, or both. Scholars still debate exactly how much reduced canine dimorphism says about aggression, mating patterns, or group structure in the earliest hominins. But the broader pattern is striking. A lineage once equipped with prominent threat teeth begins to lose some of that weaponry. The mouth becomes less about display and tearing with elongated canines, and more about processing a widening and changing range of foods. Yet the story is not one of simple softening. Some hominin branches, especially the robust Australopithecines often grouped under Paranthropus, go in almost the opposite direction when it comes to chewing machinery. Their jaws are massive, their molars are enormous, their faces are built to withstand powerful bite forces. Sagittal crests rise along the skull in some species to anchor strong chewing muscles. For a long time these forms were imagined as the inevitable step toward humanity, simply because their heavy facial anatomy looked so specialized and dramatic. But later evidence suggested something else. They may represent a side experiment, a lineage highly adapted to processing tough or fallback foods, rather than the direct route to later Homo. That is one of the recurring patterns in human evolution. A feature that looks powerful in isolation may turn out to be a specialization that narrows a species rather than carrying it forward. The branch that leads more clearly toward Homo appears to move in a different direction. Teeth tend to become smaller relative to overall jaw mass. The chewing apparatus becomes less exaggerated. Faces gradually lose some of their forward thrust. This does not happen in a straight line, and different Homo species retain different combinations of old and new traits. Homo erectus, for example, still possesses a long, low skull and substantial brow ridges, while later humans show a more rounded brain case and much reduced facial projection. Neanderthals take yet another route, with large faces, projecting mid-faces, and robust features that reflect both ancestry and adaptation. The evidence remains incomplete, But what survives in the record suggests that the face is not marching toward one predetermined ideal. It is being repeatedly rebuilt under different ecological and developmental pressures. Diet almost certainly plays a major role in this remodeling. A mouth built for heavy chewing does not need to look like one built for foods increasingly altered by cutting, pounding, scraping, or eventually cooking. Once hands can manipulate objects more effectively, once stone tools begin to assist with butchery or plant processing, once food can be reduced before it enters the mouth, the selective pressure on jaws and teeth may begin to change. The teeth no longer bear the full burden of transformation. A sharp stone edge can do part of what massive molars and thick enamel once had to do alone. Later, fire will deepen that trend by softening and predigesting foods outside the body. This does not mean tools or cooking instantly shrink the face, but it helps explain why the mouth and jaw cannot be understood separately from technology and behavior. Bodies evolve within the practical systems they build around themselves. There is a developmental dimension here too, and it may be even more important than raw force. Much of facial shape depends on the timing of growth. Extend one phase, shorten another, and the whole geometry of the skull can shift. This is why human faces are not merely ape faces made smaller. They are built through altered growth trajectories. In modern humans, the face grows in a way that leaves it tucked more neatly beneath a high, rounded brain case, with reduced prognathism and a comparatively small jaw. That pattern is tied not only to feeding and function, but also to the enlarged cranial vault, the position of the skull on the spine, and the prolonged developmental schedule that defines our species. A face, in other words, is a timetable made visible. The brow ridge deserves its own pause because it is one of the most recognizable and most misunderstood features in the fossil record. Heavy brow ridges in species such as Homo erectus and later archaic humans are often treated as signs of brutality or dim intelligence, but that is mostly projection. Brow ridges are structural features related to the shape of the face and skull, the architecture of the forehead, and the way the upper face is built beneath the brain case. They do not function as simple indicators of mental capacity. In fact, some large-brained archaic humans retain pronounced brow ridges long after other features have changed. Their presence tells us more about cranial design than about personality or worth. This is one of the recurring hazards in looking at ancient faces. Modern people read morality into anatomy. The fossil record does not support that habit. Another clue lies lower in the face, in the tongue, throat, and vocal tract, though here the record becomes more uncertain. Bones preserve the hard scaffolding of speech only imperfectly. A hyoid bone here, the base of a skull there, the dimensions of the chest and spinal canal somewhere else. From these fragments, researchers try to infer breathing control, vocal range, and the physical potential for more complex sound production. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for when fully modern speech becomes possible. But what survives in anatomy suggests a gradual reorganization rather than a sudden invention. As the face retracts, the skull balances differently, and the vocal tract changes alongside the rest of the body. The conditions for more refined vocal control may slowly improve. The body is not yet speaking in the full human sense, but it may be preparing the passageways through which later language will flow. There is a smaller, more surprising detail hidden inside all this: the human chin. It is so familiar that it rarely seems strange. Yet among known hominins, a pronounced chin is unusual and largely characteristic of our own species. Scholars still debate why it appears. Some see it as a byproduct of facial reduction and developmental reshaping rather than a feature directly selected for. Others have proposed links to mechanical stress or speech-related anatomy, though none fully settles the issue. The chin is a reminder that not every distinctive human trait must have a dramatic adaptive story. Some features may arise as secondary consequences of deeper structural shifts. Evolution is filled with such side effects, where the visible result seems meaningful precisely because it is attached to larger changes happening elsewhere. Faces also carry social consequences. Among primates, the face is a dense field of information attention, mood, rank, intent, recognition. As hominin faces change, the muscular and skeletal framework for expression changes with them. It is difficult to reconstruct the emotional life of extinct species from bone alone. Yet the importance of facial communication in primates makes it unlikely that these changes are socially neutral. A flatter face, altered brow structure, changes around the mouth, and finer motor control in the lips and tongue may all have affected how individuals signal to one another, even before symbolic language emerged. What survives in the record suggests bodies becoming not just mechanically different, but socially legible in new ways. So the face of the human line is neither a mask suddenly dropped nor a single straight path away from ape ancestry. It is a running record of trade-offs. Teeth shrink as foods and behaviors change. Jaws lighten in some branches while becoming hyper-specialized in others. Skull shape adjusts to locomotion, chewing, and brain growth all at once. Vocal anatomy slowly reorganizes beneath the surface. Expression, recognition, and communication likely shift along with the visible form. By the time later Homo begins to appear, the transformation is unmistakable, though still incomplete. The old ape framework has not vanished, but it has been repeatedly revised. And in those revisions, the face begins to carry the first unmistakable signs of a creature that is no longer merely adapting to the world it inherited, but becoming capable of remaking that world in return. Once the face begins to change, the deeper reason is not hidden only in bone. It is hidden in energy. Every body lives by an unforgiving arithmetic. Muscles demand fuel. Brains demand even more. Long childhoods demand steady support. Movement across difficult landscapes costs calories. Pregnancy and nursing cost calories. A lineage can only become more active, more social, more wide-ranging, and more cognitively expensive if it finds ways to bring in more usable energy or spend it more efficiently. This is why the story of becoming human cannot be told through posture and skulls alone. It must also be told through hunger, through the practical problem of what can be eaten, how it is obtained, how it is shared, and how much work the body must do to turn food into survival. For a long time, early hominins remain omnivorous opportunists living close to ecological limits. Plant foods still matter enormously. Tubers, fruits, seeds, nuts, shoots, and other gathered resources likely form a large part of daily life, varying by species, habitat, and season. Insects, eggs, and small animals also matter. There is no single prehistoric menu that applies to every lineage. Scholars still debate the precise dietary balance of many early hominins because the evidence comes indirectly, from teeth, isotopes, wear patterns, stone tools, cut marks, and ecological reconstruction rather than preserved meals. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests one large pattern clearly enough over time. Some branches of the human line become increasingly effective at accessing high-value foods, especially animal tissues rich in fat and protein, and that change may have altered the entire biological economy of the body. Meat is often romanticized in human origins as if it were the one magical substance that built the human brain. The reality is more complicated. Eating animal tissue is not unique to humans or even to apes. Chimpanzees hunt and consume meat. Many primates seize animal foods when they can. The important issue is not whether the ancestors of humans ever ate meat, but how regularly, how efficiently, and with what consequences. Scavenging may have been important before systematic hunting was. A carcass left by lions or other predators can provide marrow, scraps of flesh, organs, and fat to a creature clever enough to approach at the right time and equipped to cut or smash what teeth alone cannot easily process. This is where technology and diet begin to intertwine. A simple stone edge can reach calories locked behind hide and tendon. A hammerstone can open long bones and expose marrow that would otherwise remain inaccessible. That matters because marrow and fat are dense energy. They're not just food, they're concentrated fuel. In a lineage supporting increasing movement, growing brains, and prolonged juvenile dependence, high-quality calories may have been decisive. No single explanation fully accounts for the expansion of the human brain, but broader access to energy-dense foods almost certainly forms part of the answer. A body can survive on many things. A body trying to sustain costly tissue and costly behavior needs better returns. Animal foods offer those returns, especially when combined with tools that reduce the work needed to obtain them. The archaeological record begins to show this shift in scattered but significant ways. Stone tools associated with early Homo and perhaps even earlier hominins appear alongside animal bones carrying cut marks and percussion damage. These marks are small but revealing. A slice on bone can mean that a sharp edge removed flesh. Spiral fractures and impact scars can mean that long bones were deliberately broken open. Yet even here, interpretation demands caution. Cut marks alone do not always prove active hunting. Scavengers with tools can leave similar traces. In many cases, the question is not whether ancient humans were hunters or scavengers in some pure sense, but how they mixed both strategies depending on risk, skill, competition, and opportunity. A carcass on the landscape is a temporary windfall, but also a dangerous one. To use it well may require timing, nerve, cooperation, and perhaps a willingness to confront predators indirectly rather than dominate them. That willingness may have social consequences of its own. Animal food is bulky, valuable, and difficult to consume quickly in full. It invites sharing, theft, hierarchy, and cooperation all at once. A large carcass can feed more than one individual. It can also create conflict within a group and attract rivals from outside it. If hominins increasingly depend on such resources, they may also increasingly depend on the social rules, pressures, and tolerances needed to distribute them. This is one reason food cannot be separated from society. A body shaped by better energy is also a body shaped by the relationships required to secure that energy in the first place. Then, somewhere along the long arc of this story, another transformation begins to gather around the hearth. Fire is one of the most powerful forces ever brought under partial human control. But even here the word control must be handled carefully. The earliest interaction between hominins and fire is unlikely to look like regular domestic mastery. Wildfire exists long before humans. Lightning strikes dry grass. Volcanic activity ignites land. Smouldering edges of burned terrain may first have offered opportunities before they offered mastery. Animals flee flames. Carcasses are left behind. Landscapes are cleared. New plant growth appears after burning. The first hominin encounters with fire may have been opportunistic and cautious. closer to using the aftermath of combustion than producing it at will. The evidence for when regular fire use begins remains debated. Burned sediments, altered bones, and heat-affected stones are difficult to interpret with certainty in deep time because natural fire can produce confusing signals. Some sites suggest fire use earlier than others, but scholars still debate which traces represent repeated human activity and which belong to natural processes. What survives in the record suggests that habitual, socially integrated use of fire becomes clearer later than many older accounts once implied. That uncertainty matters. Fire is too important to be granted casually. Yet once hominins begin using it reliably, even intermittently, its effects are enormous. Cooking may be the greatest of those effects, though not the only one. Raw food can sustain life, but cooking changes food physically and chemically in ways that make nutrients easier to extract. It softens fibers, breaks down starches, melts fats, weakens connective tissue, and reduces the effort of chewing and digestion. In practical terms, cooking allows the body to gain more usable energy from the same material while spending less time and mechanical effort processing it. This has obvious consequences for the face and jaw, but its deeper significance lies in the gut and the brain. If food becomes easier to digest and more energy-rich in practice, the body's internal budget changes. Some researchers have argued that the control of fire and regular cooking may have helped support the evolutionary trade-off in which digestive investment shifts and greater energy becomes available for large brains and prolonged development. Scholars still debate the timing and scale of that effect. But the logic is compelling. Fire externalizes part of digestion into the environment. It allows energy to be processed before it enters the body. The hearth changes more than nutrition, it changes time. Raw foraging and chewing consume enormous portions of the day in many primates. Fire alters evening life. It extends usable hours beyond sunset. It offers warmth in cold settings, deterrence against some predators, a focal point for group gathering, and a stable place where food can be prepared, passed, and consumed together. A firelit group is not yet a civilization, but it is no longer living by daylight alone. What survives in the record suggests that the repeated use of fire may have drawn bodies and attention into tighter social circles. Faces become visible after dark. Gesture matters differently in flickering light. Food is no longer merely found and eaten. It can be brought back, transformed, and shared in a central place. This may have altered cooperation in ways that leave only indirect traces. A group organized around fire must protect it, feed it, perhaps transport embers, perhaps remember fuel sources, perhaps delay consumption for later preparation. These are small logistical acts, but they deepen planning and interdependence. An individual alone can use a burning landscape opportunistically. A group that keeps fire alive begins to build routine around a controlled force of nature. The shift is practical before it is symbolic. It changes who gathers fuel, who waits, who eats first, who stays near the camp, who ventures farther out. Even if ritual meaning comes much later, social meaning begins at once. There are costs here too. Meat acquisition brings injury risk, competition, and exposure to pathogens. Fire can burn, spread, fail, or demand labor when energy is already scarce. A lineage growing dependent on higher quality food becomes vulnerable when those foods disappear. Evolution never gives one-sided gifts, yet the long-term result seems unmistakable. Broader diets, better access to animal calories, and the eventual use of fire reshape the human line from within. Teeth no longer need to do all the heavy work. Guts may change under new energetic conditions, brains become more supportable, childhood becomes more biologically affordable. Social life becomes more tightly bound to the acquisition and distribution of valuable resources. So the human story moves forward not just because bodies stand and hands grasp, but because a lineage learns, slowly and unevenly, how to draw more life from the world than its ancestors could manage before. Meat does not create humanity by itself. Fire does not create humanity by itself, but together, along with tools, cooperation, and ecological pressure, they change the scale on which a primate body can live. They make possible a creature that spends less of its existence merely processing the world as it is found, and more of it transforming that world before it is consumed. By the time the human line begins drawing more energy from meat, marrow, and eventually cooked food, another quiet revolution is taking shape in stone. It does not begin with elegance. The earliest tools are not masterpieces waiting in embryonic form for civilization to notice them. They are blunt, fractured, practical things, often little more than broken rock with a useful edge. And yet in their simplicity lies one of the deepest turning points in the human story. A stone that has been intentionally struck is more than an object. It is a decision preserved in matter. It is thought hardened into form, however briefly and however crudely. Long after the hand that made it has disappeared, the edge remains to say that someone, somewhere, did not merely pick up the world as it was found. Someone altered it on purpose. The earliest evidence is still debated in detail, and the uncertainty matters. At Lomekwi in Kenya, stones dated to around 3.3 million years ago suggest that some kind of deliberate stoneworking may predate the genus Homo. If that interpretation holds, then tool-related behavior begins deeper in time than older narratives once allowed, perhaps among Australopithecines or related hominins with brains still far smaller than later humans. Scholars still debate how these stones were made, how systematic the behavior was, and whether such early assemblages represent a regular tradition or a more limited experimental phase. The evidence remains incomplete, but even the possibility is important, because it reminds us that manual intelligence and object transformation do not wait for a fully modern mind to arrive. They begin earlier, in bodies already walking upright, already handling the world differently, already capable of repetition and choice. Then, with the Oldowan tradition, the pattern becomes clearer. Around 2.6 million years ago and after, sites begin to show repeated production of simple stone flakes and cores. These tools are modest in appearance, but they reveal something profound about cognition. To make a flake intentionally, a napper must recognize that one stone can be used to alter another in a predictable way. The maker must choose raw material, judge angle, control force, and understand that the useful part may be the detached fragment rather than the remaining core. None of this requires abstract philosophy, but it does require foresight of a practical kind. A tool is not simply found, it is anticipated. The maker strikes not just at a stone, but at a result not yet visible. That anticipatory element matters because it changes the relationship between mind and environment. A creature that uses a naturally sharp object is exploiting opportunity. A creature that creates a sharp edge when needed is beginning to treat matter as something with hidden potential. The world no longer consists only of ready-made resources. It contains latent forms waiting to be produced by knowledgeable hands. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It trains attention in a new way. The eye begins to scan landscapes not only for food, shelter, danger, and water, but for stone quality, fracture lines, suitable hammerstones, transportable nodules, and places where raw material could be found again. Memory broadens. A useful outcrop becomes as important as a fruiting grove. A riverbank becomes not just a place to drink, but a place to gather the right kind of stone. The act of making tools also imposes sequence on behavior. That is easy to overlook when looking at a finished flake in a museum case. But stoneworking unfolds in steps. One stone is selected, another chosen to strike it. The angle is adjusted. The force is controlled. The resulting edge is tested, perhaps used, perhaps modified further. Even the simplest lithic technology requires an ordered chain of action. Later technologies will make that sequence longer and more demanding. But the underlying principle begins here. A brain that can hold steps in order, inhibit useless strikes, and repeat successful patterns gains an advantage. Toolmaking is not merely a sign of intelligence already present. It may help train the very cognitive habits that later become more elaborate planning, motor control, error correction, and the ability to imagine a finished result before it exists. This is one reason stone tools may have changed the mind as much as the hand. Repeated flaking creates feedback between intention and consequence. A strike that lands poorly teaches something. A flake that cuts cleanly reinforces something. Unlike many behaviors that vanish into the air once performed, stoneworking leaves stable results that can be inspected, compared, and perhaps imitated. A young individual watching an experienced one may not understand everything at once, but the object itself remains available as a guide. Its shape can be handled, its edge can be tested, its use can be observed after its making. In that sense, stone technology externalizes knowledge. Part of the solution now exists outside the body, in a durable form where others can encounter it. That durability may be one of the least glamorous and most consequential properties of tools. Most animal behaviors disappear the moment they're finished. A chimpanzee uses a stick and then moves on. A nest is built and then abandoned. But a stone flake can outlast its maker by millions of years. Even in its own time, it can outlast the brief act of manufacture and remain part of a group's working world. It can be carried, reused, lost, found again, or perhaps recognized by others as something worth keeping. This gives technology a kind of memory independent of the nervous system. It allows solutions to persist in the environment and creates new possibilities for learning. What survives in the record suggests that the human line begins, through tools, to place intelligence partly outside the skull. The uses of these early tools are practical but far-reaching. Sharp flakes can strip flesh from bone, cut hide, slice plant material, and perhaps shape wood or other perishable objects that do not survive in the archaeological record. Hammerstones can break bone for marrow and crack tough materials. A simple core and flake technology may not look impressive beside later hand axes or blades, but it opens the body's access to resources that teeth and fingernails alone cannot efficiently manage. In doing so, it feeds back into diet, energy, and time. A carcass can be processed faster. Valuable tissue can be removed before competitors arrive. Plant materials can be altered before eating. Labor becomes more efficient in targeted ways, and efficiency, in an energy-limited lineage, is never trivial. There is also an emotional realism here that the archaeological record only hints at. Tool use is not a smooth performance. It involves failure. Stones shatter wrongly, hands are cut, raw materials disappoint. A group may carry stone farther than expected because the local material is poor, useful edges dull, Children imitate and get it wrong. One individual may be more skilled than another. Over time, such variation matters. If better toolmakers feed themselves and others more effectively, if their methods are noticed and copied, then skill becomes socially significant. The group is no longer surviving only through inherited anatomy, but through unevenly distributed knowledge. That brings teaching into the story. Though teaching at first may be subtle, it need not resemble formal instruction. It may be no more than repeated exposure, tolerance of close watching, shared activity near a work area, or the opportunity for juveniles to handle discarded flakes and battered cores. Scholars still debate how much explicit teaching is required for the earliest technologies, and at what point imitation alone stops being enough. But as stone traditions become more consistent across sites and generations, the idea of purely accidental transmission becomes harder to maintain. Reliable tool traditions imply social learning. Social learning implies attention, patience, and a group structure in which the young can remain near the knowledgeable long enough to absorb technique. This is where survival becomes increasingly cultural, even before culture takes on the grandeur often associated with the word. In its earliest form, culture is not art, religion, or myth. It is shared method. It is the passing on of practical solutions that are not written into the genes but into behavior. A hominin born into such a group inherits not only a body adapted for upright walking and manipulation, but a repertoire of learned habits about stone, food, and task sequence. Two populations with similar anatomy may live differently if their tool traditions differ. One may process carcasses more thoroughly. Another may transport raw material more often. Another may prefer certain stone types or maintain activity areas where napping is repeated. None of this is civilization, but it is no longer mere instinct either. The deeper consequence is that evolution itself is beginning to move through a new channel. Once learned behavior helps determine who survives, the boundary between biology and culture begins to blur. Better hands support better tools support better diets support more demanding brains and longer childhoods. Longer childhoods create more time for learning. More learning supports more complex traditions. The loop deepens. No single explanation fully accounts for how far this process had advanced in the earliest tool-making populations, but the direction is unmistakable. The lineage is becoming one that survives not only by what its body is, but by what its members know how to do with the world around them. So the first stone tools matter not because they are beautiful, but because they are cumulative. They reveal a creature beginning to live inside chains of action, stored skill, remembered places, and material solutions that outlast the moment. A fractured rock on an ancient ground surface is easy to overlook, yet in that fracture lies one of the clearest early signs that the human line is changing its terms of existence. The hand strikes stone, the stone changes shape. The shape changes what the body can eat and make, and the altered world feeds back into the mind. In that exchange between rock and intention, survival ceases to be only a matter of enduring nature. It becomes, increasingly, a matter of reshaping nature in small, repeatable ways. Once stone tools begin to preserve intention outside the body, the old African homeland no longer holds the whole story. For millions of years, the human line is shaped within Africa's shifting mosaics of woodland, grassland, lakeshore, and broken forest, and those landscapes remain the true cradle of everything that follows. But eventually one branch does more than adapt within that cradle. It leaves it, not in a single heroic migration, not in a grand procession moving steadily toward destiny, but in repeated expansions, withdrawals, experiments, and survivals. The ancestral ground is not abandoned all at once. It continues producing lineages, innovations, and populations long after some of its descendants begin appearing elsewhere. Yet once hominins move beyond Africa into Eurasia and farther east, evolution stops being a regional story. It becomes a continental one. This outward movement is often told too simply, as if one fully formed species steps across a border and spreads smoothly into empty space. What survives in the record suggests something far messier. There may have been multiple dispersals rather than one. Some populations may have moved out and vanished without leaving lasting descendants. Others may have survived only in restricted regions. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the earliest phases, and scholars still debate exactly which species leave Africa first and how often they do so. But by the time Homo erectus and closely related early Homo populations appear beyond Africa, the scale of the change is unmistakable. A lineage once rooted in one environmental theatre is now testing itself against unfamiliar climates, new predators, different prey, novel plants, and distances far greater than those crossed by its ancestors. Dmanisi, in present-day Georgia, stands as one of the most remarkable windows into that transition. There, early Homo remains more than 1.7 million years old, show that hominins are already living far beyond Africa, surprisingly early. The individuals from Dmanisi are especially revealing because they do not look like triumphant superhumans. Their brains are relatively small compared with later Homo. Their anatomy is in some ways primitive, in others more derived. Their stone tools are simple, yet they are there, in the Caucasus, at the edge of a world their ancestors did not inhabit. That detail matters enormously. It suggests that the first successful dispersals out of Africa may not require the full suite of later human traits. A lineage does not need to become fully modern before it becomes mobile on a much larger map. It only needs enough versatility, enough endurance, enough cooperative resilience, and enough tolerance for new conditions to survive the crossing. That tolerance is one of the great quiet achievements of Homo erectus and related populations. If earlier hominins already learn how to live in mixed African environments, Homo erectus seems to push that flexibility much further. The body is more recognizably committed to long-distance walking. Legs lengthen relative to arms. Overall proportions in many specimens suggest a stride better suited to covering ground efficiently. The pelvis and lower limbs support a more fully terrestrial existence. This is not merely a creature that can walk upright. It is a creature increasingly built to keep walking. Some researchers have also argued that changes in sweating, body shape, and heat management may play important roles here, helping hominins move and forage over larger territories under hot conditions. No single explanation fully accounts for their success. But the body of Homo erectus looks like the body of a traveller. Travel, however, is not movement for its own sake. It follows resources, opportunities, and pressures. Climatic fluctuation continues to shape the broader world, opening routes at some times and closing them at others. Grasslands expand and contract. River valleys serve as corridors. Coastal zones may attract movement, though the record along ancient shorelines is often lost to changing sea levels. The Levant offers a gateway between Africa and Eurasia, but not a simple one. It is a bottleneck sensitive to climate, vegetation, and competition. A population moving through it must negotiate heat, water, prey, and unfamiliar ecological webs. To the north lie cooler seasonal worlds. To the east lie vast reaches of steppe, woodland, mountain, and eventually tropical Asia. The old African problem of instability does not disappear, it is magnified. This is where migration becomes less a journey and more a long experiment in being human under different skies. A group moving into Eurasia encounters winters unlike African dry seasons, day lengths unlike equatorial rhythms, animal communities it has never known, pathogens and parasites it has not evolved alongside, and landscapes where shelter, fuel, and food demand new timing. A lineage that survives here cannot do so by repeating old habits unchanged. It must adjust roots, seasonality, diet, and perhaps social structure. Children must learn different dangers. Adults must remember different places. Knowledge becomes regional in a deeper way. Africa remains the ancestral centre. But the human story is no longer held together by one ecological memory alone. Farther east, the story becomes even more remarkable. Homo erectus reaches Southeast Asia and eventually islands such as Java, showing a capacity for range expansion that would have seemed unimaginable in the age of Australopithecines. Whether every crossing involves deliberate water travel or the use of land connections exposed during lower sea levels remains debated in some cases. But the basic reality is clear enough: the human line is no longer confined by the limits that once contained it. It is spreading into humid tropics, temperate zones, uplands, and open country. What survives in the fossil and archaeological records suggests not a perfect conqueror, but a persistent one. A lesser-known truth about this persistence is that success does not look the same everywhere. Different regional populations of Homo erectus and related forms show different combinations of traits. Some are more robust, some more gracile. Some seem associated with Acheulean hand-axe traditions, while others persist with simpler toolkits for long periods. The famous hand axe itself, symmetrical and carefully shaped, marks another step in planned technology, but even here distribution is uneven. In some parts of Asia, large cutting tools are scarce or absent for reasons scholars still debate. Perhaps suitable raw materials differ, perhaps traditions diverge, perhaps ecological needs are not identical across regions. The evidence remains incomplete, but the implication is important. As the human line spreads, it does not remain culturally uniform. Migration does not merely enlarge territory, it multiplies variation. That variation becomes evolutionary as well as cultural. Once populations are spread across broad distances, separated by mountains, deserts, forests, and time, they do not all change together. Local adaptation begins working on different bodies in different conditions. Isolation increases the chance that one regional population will drift away from another. Some traits may spread through contact, others may remain local. The species-level categories scientists later impose on these populations often struggle to keep up with the messiness of the process. What looks like one spreading lineage from afar may contain the seeds of several later branches. This is why leaving Africa matters so much. It does not simply widen the map. It creates the conditions for the family tree to become more crowded, more regional, and more complicated than a single homeland could sustain alone. There is also a human atmosphere to this movement that fossils barely capture. To leave familiar ground is not, in evolutionary terms, a conscious act of exploration. It is a matter of following game, tracking water, avoiding competitors, occupying favourable habitats, and reproducing in new places until the new place becomes home. But the lived experience, if it could be recovered, would still feel immense. New winds, new smells in the soil, new seasonal cold, unknown animal calls after dusk, different stone underfoot, different river rhythms, different grasses hiding different teeth. infants born far from the landscapes that shaped their grandparents. Knowledge stretched thinner at the edge of what the group has learned so far. Migration is not only expansion, it is uncertainty carried forward. And uncertainty is precisely what makes this outward movement so consequential. In Africa, the lineage is forged by instability. Outside Africa, it is diversified by it. Each new region becomes a fresh test of anatomy, behavior, and technology. Some populations disappear, some endure, some alter enough that later humans will classify them as distinct branches. By the end of this process, the human line is no longer a local African experiment in upright primates with tools. It is a distributed, evolving presence across much of the old world, still vulnerable, still incomplete, but no longer geographically singular. So leaving the ancestral ground is not a side episode in the human story. It is the moment the story ceases to belong to one ecological theatre and begins unfolding across many. The walkers who once learned to cross broken woodlands now cross continents. The hands that once shaped crude flakes now carry local traditions into foreign stone landscapes. The minds that once remembered African roots now memorize river valleys, mountain passes, and seasonal cycles under unfamiliar stars. And with that expansion, the human line enters a new phase, one in which distance itself becomes an evolutionary force. Once the human line spreads across continents, the old image of evolution as a ladder becomes impossible to maintain. It survives in popular imagination because it is easy to draw and easy to understand one figure rising neatly, from bent ape to upright human, each stage replacing the last in orderly progression. But the fossil record tells a far stranger story. Human evolution is not a ladder, it is a branching, overlapping, crowded history in which multiple kinds of human and near-human exist at once, sometimes in neighbouring regions, sometimes separated by vast distances, sometimes meeting, sometimes vanishing, and sometimes leaving traces inside one another. The family tree is not a march, it is a thicket. This becomes clear as soon as the different hominin branches are placed side by side in time instead of arranged from primitive to advanced. Australopithecines persist for long periods while early Homo is already emerging. Robust forms adapted for heavy chewing live alongside more graceful forms pursuing different strategies. Homo erectus endures for an astonishing span, long enough to overlap with later human branches that once might have been imagined as its replacements. Neanderthals occupy Eurasia, while anatomically modern humans eventually appear in Africa and then beyond it. Denisovans, known at first from almost nothing more than a finger bone, teeth, and genetic traces, are present somewhere within that same broad later world. For long stretches of prehistory, the Earth is not inhabited by one humanity in waiting. It is inhabited by several human lineages at once. That fact changes the tone of the whole story. It means that being human is never a single condition moving steadily toward perfection. It is a set of experiments running in parallel under different environments, diets, climates, technologies, and social traditions. Some branches become highly specialized, some remain flexible, some spread widely, some stay regionally confined. Some last far longer than anyone once expected. If one could stand in the deep past and look across the full span of a few 100,000 years at once, the most striking impression would not be inevitability, it would be plurality. Australopithecus already reveals the early part of this plurality. These hominins walk upright habitually enough to mark a major break from older ape ancestors, yet they retain many ape-like features in the upper body and skull. They are not one uniform creature repeated across Africa, but a range of species differing in proportions, habitat, and likely behaviour. Some seem relatively generalist, others appear more specialised. Then there are the robust Australopithecines, often placed in Paranthropus, with their massive jaws and large molars, powerful chewing anatomy built for a hard and perhaps unpredictable dietary world. For a time these lineages share the continent with early members of Homo. That alone should end the ladder image. One branch does not politely vanish before the next arrives. They coexist. The genus Homo itself does not simplify matters, it complicates them. Early Homo includes forms that do not fit comfortably into one tidy sequence: Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and other fragmentary or debated populations suggest a period when brain size, facial structure, body form, and tool association are still highly variable. Scholars still debate how many species should be recognized here and how exactly they relate to one another. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the tangled emergence of Homo from earlier hominin diversity. But what survives in the record suggests a branching process, not a straight one. Several related populations may be exploring similar adaptive territory at once. Then comes Homo erectus, or perhaps a cluster of closely related forms that includes African and Eurasian populations, often separated by name depending on how researchers classify them. What makes Homo erectus so important is not that it is the first real human in any simple sense, but that it becomes one of the most successful and persistent hominin lineages ever known. It spreads widely, survives for immense spans of time, and shows a body more fully committed to terrestrial life and long-distance movement. Yet even Homo erectus is not a final answer. It is a powerful branch, not the end of branching. In some places it likely gives rise to later regional forms. In others it disappears. Its long survival means it overlaps in time, directly or indirectly, with other human kinds that are developing different traits elsewhere. By the Middle Pleistocene, the thicket grows denser. Populations often grouped under names such as Homo heidelbergensis, archaic Homo sapiens, or other regional labels appear across Africa and Eurasia, and from some of these populations later lineages emerge. In Europe and Western Asia, one branch becomes the Neanderthals. For a long time, Neanderthals are imagined as brutish failures, thick-browed side characters in a drama that belongs to modern humans. The actual picture is far more interesting. Neanderthals are highly successful people of Ice Age Eurasia, adapted to cold environments, capable hunters, skilled toolmakers, users of fire, and participants in complex social worlds. Their bodies are not primitive leftovers. They are specialized outcomes of long evolution in demanding climates. Broad chests, powerful limbs, large faces, and distinctive skull shapes all reflect a lineage that is as real and as complete in its own terms as ours. And then there are the Denisovans, perhaps the most haunting proof that the human past remains only partly visible. Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia had long been an archaeological site of interest, but the revelation that emerged from it changed human origins research in a way few discoveries ever do. From a tiny finger bone, later joined by teeth and other fragmentary remains, ancient DNA revealed a population genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, yet closely related to Neanderthals as a sister lineage. Physically, almost nothing was known at first. No complete skull, no full skeleton, no clear portrait of the face or body. An entire human group stepped into science almost without an image, known first through molecules rather than bones. That alone marks a turning point in the history of paleoanthropology. For generations, extinct humans were identified through anatomy jaw shape, brain case size, teeth, brow ridges, limb proportions. Denisovans arrived differently. Their existence was announced by genetic distance hidden in a tiny fossil. It was one of the clearest signs that the visible fossil record was only a fraction of the real story. If a whole human lineage could remain unknown until DNA exposed it, then how many other lineages had left only faint or ambiguous traces? Scholars still debate the Denisovans' full geographic range and how variable they were across Asia. But what survives in genetic data suggests they were not a small local curiosity. They may have ranged widely, perhaps from Siberia into East and Southeast Asia, and they appear to have adapted to extreme environments, including high altitudes in ancestral populations linked to the Tibetan Plateau. This crowded world means that the later human past is best imagined not as a single stage occupied by one kind of being after another, but as a landscape inhabited by neighbours, cousins, and occasional strangers. Some of them may have looked recognisably similar at a distance. Others may have seemed distinctly different in build, face, or movement. Some may have shared technologies or behaviour through contact. Others may have remained isolated for long spans. The crucial point is that anatomical modernity does not erase diversity overnight. Even when Homo sapiens begins to spread more widely, it enters a world already occupied by other humans. That has emotional consequences as well as scientific ones. It forces a different kind of humility. Modern humans are used to living as the only surviving human species, and that singularity can feel natural simply because it is familiar. But for most of the deeper past, it is not natural at all. It is unusual. The normal condition of human evolution seems to be diversity. The lonely modern condition, one surviving branch left to contemplate the lost rest, is the exception. The old ladder collapses completely under that weight. No rung captures the reality of multiple lineages overlapping in time. No straight ascent can explain why robust Australopithecines persist beside early Homo, why Homo erectus endures across continents, why Neanderthals flourish in Ice Age Eurasia, why Denisovans remain hidden until genetics reveals them, or why modern humans emerge not onto an empty stage but into a populated one. Evolution here does not resemble progress in a single file. It resembles weather fronts moving across the same planet, crossing, separating, lingering, and dissolving. And once that is understood, a deeper question begins to emerge. If many humans exist at once, then what happens when their territories touch? Do they merely replace one another? Do they compete, imitate, avoid, or mix? For a long time, science leaned towards simple replacement, but the bones and the genes, taken together, have begun to suggest something more entangled. The branches of the human family do not always remain cleanly apart. Sometimes, when they meet, they leave pieces of themselves behind in one another. The discovery that ancient human branches could leave genetic traces inside living people changed the story more radically than almost any fossil ever had. For a long time, extinction was imagined in simple terms. A lineage disappears, and that is the end of it. Its bones remain if chance allows. Its tools remain if stone or fire hardens them into survival. Its landscapes keep no memory except in altered sediments and scattered prey bones. Then genetics began to expose a different kind of afterlife. Some vanished humans did not disappear cleanly at all. They remained, faintly but measurably, inside the bodies of those who lived on after them. Extinction in the human family turned out not always to mean erasure. Sometimes it meant dilution, absorption, and survival in fragments. This was not how many researchers expected the story to unfold. Earlier models often lean toward a cleaner replacement narrative. In that view, anatomically modern humans expand out of Africa and largely replace older Eurasian populations such as Neanderthals, perhaps with some competition, perhaps with superior flexibility or social scale, but without much biological entanglement. The picture was tidy. It kept branches separate. It treated species boundaries as firmer than the fossil record had ever quite justified. Then, ancient DNA arrived with a different message. Living people outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry. Not much, but enough to show that encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals were not rare accidents with no descendants. They were real enough to leave a persistent signal. The family tree, once drawn with clean dividing lines, had to be redrawn with crossings. And then Denisovans made the picture stranger still. At Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, a place cold, dark, and unassuming in outward appearance, the genetic record began revealing a human population science had never properly seen before. Not because it had left rich cemeteries or dramatic skulls, but because a tiny fossil contained a genome that did not match Neanderthals or modern humans. The result was almost uncanny. An extinct human group entered scientific understanding first not through its face or posture, but through its sequence of nucleotides. The cave became one of the most important places in the history of human origins, not because it yielded an abundance of bones, but because those few remains opened a hidden branch of the human family. What followed from that discovery was even more unsettling to older ideas of human separation. Denisovan ancestry survives in some present-day populations, especially in parts of Oceania and among certain peoples of island Southeast Asia, with lower or more complex signals in some Asian populations as well. This means modern humans did not merely pass Denisovans on the road of prehistory. They met them closely enough to have children with them, and those children left descendants. The same broad pattern applies to Neanderthals. Human evolution, at least in its later phases, is not a tale of one superior lineage replacing all others without contact. It is a story of movement, overlap, exchange, and mixture. That does not mean boundaries vanish altogether. Distinct lineages remain distinct for long enough to evolve recognizable anatomical and genetic differences. Neanderthals are not just Europeans with heavy brows. Denisovans are not simply a local variant of Homo sapiens. These are real branches with long independent histories behind them. But independence is not the same as absolute isolation. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how many episodes of interbreeding occurred, in which places, and in what directions. What survives in genomes suggests multiple encounters rather than one single meeting. Some exchanges may have been brief and local. Others may have involved repeated contact zones over long periods. The older image of sealed-off species no longer holds. One of the most extraordinary finds from Denisova Cave makes this entanglement feel almost immediate. Among the remains there is evidence for an individual who had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, a first-generation child of two distinct human lineages. That one person, known only through fragmentary bone and DNA, says more about the nature of the ancient world than whole shelves of older theory. It shows that these lineages were not merely neighbouring abstractions. They could meet directly, reproduce directly, and leave behind offspring whose existence collapses any lingering confidence in a cleanly partitioned prehistoric world. Deep in the cave record, in the cold sediment of the Altai, the human family is revealed not as a set of separate rooms but as a house with broken walls. Ancient DNA also changes how extinction itself must be understood. If Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry persists in living people, then their disappearance as independent populations is only one part of the story. They vanish as distinct branches. Yes, but parts of them survive inside another lineage. That survival is not sentimental, it is biological. Certain inherited variants continue being copied through generation after generation, travelling into futures their original populations never saw. In that sense, modern humans are not only the descendants of an African lineage that expanded across the world, they are also, to a limited but meaningful degree, composites. The final surviving human branch is not genetically pure, it is historically mixed. Some of those inherited fragments may have mattered more than others. Many introgressed variants were probably neutral or nearly so, mere remnants carried along by descent. Some may have been harmful in new genetic backgrounds and gradually removed by selection, but others appear to have offered advantages in particular environments. One of the most striking examples involves high-altitude adaptation in populations linked to the Tibetan Plateau. A genetic variant associated with the EPAS1 region, important in responding to low oxygen, appears to have a Denisovan origin. If that interpretation is correct, then adaptation to life in thin air was not produced solely by new mutations within modern human populations after arrival. Instead, modern humans may have inherited a useful physiological solution from an older human lineage already adapted, at least in some branch of its range, to such extreme conditions. That possibility widens the significance of interbreeding enormously. It means contact between human lineages is not just a matter of ancestry percentages. It may also be a mechanism by which ecological knowledge, written into genomes over long selection histories, is transferred from one population to another. A lineage arriving in a harsh new environment does not always need to evolve every adaptation from scratch if another lineage has already done some of that work. Genes, in this sense, become part of the inheritance of contact. Denisovans, mysterious as they remain in appearance, may still be present today in the physiology of people living at altitude. An invisible ancient cousin may still be helping living bodies breathe. Neanderthal contributions appear in other domains too, especially in immune-related genes, skin biology, and aspects of metabolism, though the full picture remains complex and sometimes controversial. Some inherited variants may have helped modern humans adjust to pathogens or climates encountered outside Africa. Others may have imposed costs under later conditions. No single explanation fully accounts for which archaic genes persisted and why. Natural selection acts unevenly. Some pieces are useful, some merely tolerated, some eventually removed. The modern human genome is not a museum displaying archaic inheritance neatly labelled. It is the result of filtering, reshuffling, and long coexistence between inherited fragments and later selection pressures. There is an irony here that reaches back to the old fantasy of the accidental mutation. Popular imagination often craves one decisive genetic event that makes humans human. Ancient DNA reveals almost the opposite. Some of what living humans are comes not from one unique innovation arising in isolation, but from mixture with other human groups once thought entirely separate. Becoming human, in its later phases, includes borrowing from lost relatives. The genome is not a sealed record of solitary ascent. It is a layered archive of encounters. This is especially haunting in the case of Denisovans because so little of their physical world is visible. We know they existed, We know they were related to Neanderthals. We know they mixed with modern humans and at least once directly with Neanderthals. We know their genes survive in living populations, but their faces remain largely uncertain. Their full range remains debated. Their tools, behaviours, and regional diversity are only partly understood through associated archaeology and fragmentary finds. The evidence remains incomplete. Few human groups of such significance have remained so visually obscure. They are known not through portrait but through inheritance, in a strange way. Modern people may carry more Denisovan certainty in their cells than science yet possesses in its museums. The emotional weight of that is hard to ignore. Somewhere in Ice Age Asia, in mountain corridors, river valleys, forests, or high cold plateaus, groups of humans met other groups who were not quite the same. They may have noticed differences in build, face, voice, habit, or movement. They may also have noticed something more familiar than strange. Whatever the social reality of those meetings, the biological result is clear enough. The ancient world did not keep its human branches perfectly apart. It allowed them, sometimes, to cross. And that changes the meaning of our survival. Modern humans are the last clearly surviving human species, but not because all others vanished without remainder. We endure carrying traces of those others within us. Neanderthals are gone, yet not wholly gone. Denisovans are gone, yet not wholly gone. Their bones are rare, their landscapes altered, their names invented only yesterday. But fragments of their long history continue in living blood. The family tree did not simply prune itself down to one branch. It braided before it narrowed, and in that braid the lost remain present, not as ghosts, but as inheritance. For most of human evolution, the unusual condition is not that only one humankind exists. The unusual condition is now. The deeper past is crowded with lineages that rise, endure, adapt, spread, narrow, divide, and vanish. Some leave abundant stone tools and fragmentary bones. Some leave almost nothing except a few broken teeth or a genetic signal hidden inside later people. Yet one question hangs over all of them with increasing weight as the story moves closer to the present. Why do so many branches disappear? Why does a family tree once so full end with a single, clearly surviving human species and a faint inheritance from the rest? The answer, as so often in prehistory, resists simplicity. No single explanation fully accounts for the loss of earlier human lineages. Extinction is rarely a clean verdict delivered by one cause. More often it is the cumulative result of bad timing, shrinking numbers, ecological instability, local competition, and the unforgiving mathematics of small populations. Climate is part of that mathematics everywhere. The Pleistocene is not a stable age in which human groups settle into permanent equilibrium. It is a world of glacial pulses, interglacial warmth, shifting rainfall belts, changing vegetation, advancing ice, retreating forests, reorganized rivers, exposed land bridges, and then drowned coastlines. A population can survive for thousands of years under one pattern of resources, only to find that pattern broken by the next great swing in temperature or moisture. Hunting grounds contract, familiar prey migrates or declines, plant foods become less reliable, corridors close while barriers harden, refuges remain, but they do not remain everywhere. A lineage may adapt brilliantly to one world and still falter when that world changes faster than its behavior. Demography or distribution can keep pace. This is especially important for human populations living near the ecological edge. A lineage spread thinly across cold steppe Mountain corridors, dense forest margins, or fragmented woodland may appear widespread on a map and still remain vulnerable in practice. Distribution is not the same as security. Groups may be isolated from one another by distance, glaciers, deserts, or hostile habitat. If contact weakens, mating networks shrink, genetic diversity falls, local innovations are less likely to spread. A bad run of seasons can hit one pocket after another without any rescue from neighbouring populations. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in paleoclimate studies, archaeology, and genetics suggests that many extinct human groups were not vast, dense civilizations spread beyond disruption. They were small populations living close to environmental thresholds. Small populations suffer from dangers larger groups can absorb. A few failed births matter more, a few injuries matter more. The loss of a skilled hunter, toolmaker, or elder matters more. Disease matters more. Chance itself matters more. This is one of the least dramatic and most important truths about extinction. A lineage does not always vanish because it is decisively outcompeted by a superior rival. Sometimes it vanishes because its numbers dip low enough that ordinary bad luck becomes lethal at the population level. A flood, a harsh winter, a poor migration season, a local prey collapse, an epidemic, a sequence of infant deaths, and a group can cross from fragile continuity into irreversible decline. Evolution is full of grand patterns, but it is also full of arithmetic. Neanderthals are the most famous case because their disappearance sits close enough to our own rise to feel personal. They survive for hundreds of thousands of years in Western Eurasia, enduring repeated climatic swings, hunting large game, making complex tools, using fire, caring for injured individuals, and adapting to severe environments that would have broken many other lineages. Nothing about them suggests a species on the verge of failure in any simple sense. And yet they vanish as a distinct population not long after modern humans spread into their ranges. For generations, the temptation has been to explain this with a single verdict. Modern humans were smarter, faster, more social, more innovative, and therefore simply replaced them. That story is neat. It is also too neat. Scholars still debate the exact balance of causes, but what survives in the record suggests a more layered process. Neanderthals likely faced repeated climatic stress, fragmented habitats, low population density, limited long-distance connectivity, and eventual competition or demographic pressure from incoming Homo sapiens. Interbreeding occurred as well, meaning replacement was not absolute. Their disappearance as a separate lineage may have involved not only death and displacement, but also partial absorption. Denisovans are even more elusive, which makes their disappearance harder to map and perhaps even more revealing. They seem to have been widespread enough to leave ancestry in multiple later populations, and they may have occupied environments ranging from cold Siberian cave regions to high-altitude Asia, and possibly farther south. Yet their bones are so scarce, their visible anatomy so uncertain, that tracing their decline is like trying to reconstruct a fading fire from a few sparks in ash. Did different Denisovan populations vanish at different times? Were some absorbed into expanding modern human populations? Did climatic shifts cut apart their range until isolated pockets failed? The evidence remains incomplete, but their story fits the same broader pattern. Even a lineage capable of major regional adaptation does not persist forever if its populations are sparse, its habitats unstable, and its contact zones overtaken by other humans moving with different demographic strengths. Competition matters here, but not always in the crude sense of battle. One human group can outcompete another demographically without ever needing constant direct violence. A population with broader social networks may maintain more stable exchange of mates, information, and materials across distance. A population with more flexible diet, denser numbers, or better buffering against local shortages may recover from bad years more effectively. A group with longer-range alliances or more reliable symbolic communication may coordinate movement and cooperation across broader landscapes. Even slight advantages, repeated over generations, can matter enormously when two lineages occupy overlapping territories. One does not need to annihilate the other outright. It may simply reproduce more consistently, occupy more ecological niches, and keep its populations connected while the other fragments. This is one reason modern human expansion can be so consequential without requiring a myth of immediate superiority in every domain. Homo sapiens may not have possessed one magic trait that doomed every rival on contact. Instead, a combination of flexibility, social scale, innovation, symbolic communication, and demographic resilience may have given some populations a cumulative advantage once they spread widely. Better long-distance exchange, more varied subsistence strategies, broader use of symbols or social identity, or simply larger mating networks could make a decisive difference over time. No single explanation fully accounts for why our branch persists while others fade, but the pattern suggests compounding advantages rather than one dramatic secret. There is also the possibility of simple historical timing. A lineage may survive repeated climatic crises for hundreds of thousands of years and then meet the wrong combination of pressures at once. A cold pulse arrives during prey instability. A neighboring human population expands. A local refuge shrinks. A disease spreads. Genetic diversity is already low. A few generations later, the branch has crossed a threshold it cannot recross. Extinction often feels sudden in the record because the record itself is sparse. In lived time, it may have been uneven, regional, and prolonged, with some pockets disappearing early and others lingering for millennia. There may never have been a single final Neanderthal or a single final Denisovan in any meaningful emotional sense. There were probably scattered last communities, then scattered last families, then scattered last children whose descendants either ended or disappeared into another population. That last possibility matters. Human extinction is often incomplete. The bodies vanish, the distinct culture vanishes, the local identity vanishes, but genes, habits, or techniques may survive in others. We already know this happened biologically through introgression. It may also have happened behaviorally in ways harder to prove. Contact between human groups could transfer knowledge as well as ancestry. A tool tradition, a hunting strategy, a route through mountains, a tolerance for a difficult environment. These things do not fossilize neatly inside the label of a species. They can pass across boundaries, blur, and continue after the population that first refined them is gone. So the disappearance of other humans should not be imagined only as a parade of failures. Many of these lineages were successful beyond ordinary animal standards. Homo erectus endures for an immense span of time. Neanderthals master harsh ice age ecologies. Denisovans leave adaptations still meaningful in living people. Their endings do not erase their accomplishments. Extinction in evolution is not a moral judgment. It is the ordinary fate of most branches, including many extraordinary ones. The surprising thing is not that so many vanished. The surprising thing is that one branch remained, carrying a few fragments of the others within it. And that leaves a final uneasy truth. The same forces that ended earlier human lineages were not alien to us. Climate volatility, low numbers, ecological stress, fragmentation, dependence on cooperation, and the hazards of chance shaped our branch too. We survived them where others did not, but not because we stood outside the rules that governed the rest. We survived as one more human lineage moving through a dangerous world, vulnerable to the same pressures, altered by the same instability, and never fully guaranteed a future. The difference is only that our contingency happened to continue. In the end, the most revealing legacy of this story is not that one ape lineage became clever enough to dominate the planet. It is that becoming human was never a clean break from the rest of life, never a single mutation, never a straight ascent, and never the work of one isolated trait. What survives after all the vanished branches, all the scattered bones, all the broken stone and ancient DNA, is a deeper pattern. The human line is shaped by entanglement, body and landscape, mutation and time, hunger and invention, childhood and memory, isolation and mixture, loss and survival. If there is a final lesson in how apes became human, it is that humanity does not emerge by escaping nature, but by remaining exposed to it for so long, under such unstable conditions, that one primate lineage becomes increasingly able to adapt by changing not only itself, but the terms of its own existence. That ability is often mistaken for inevitability. Looking backward from the modern world, with cities lit through the night and machines circling the planet, it is easy to imagine that the outcome was always waiting to happen. But nothing in the earlier story supports that comfort. For millions of years the human line is precarious. It is one branch among many. It carries old ape inheritance everywhere in its body. It experiments awkwardly with upright walking, with hands freed a little more from locomotion, with longer childhoods and deeper memory, with tools crude enough to fit in a palm, with wider diets, with fire that may be lost as easily as used. It spreads, divides, meets other humans, disappears in places, persists in others. Its success is real, but it is never guaranteed. The line that leads to modern humans is not destiny fulfilled. It is contingency that lasted. What makes that contingency extraordinary is the way it accumulates. Once posture changes, the hands begin to matter differently. Once the hands matter differently, tools begin to matter differently. Once tools begin altering access to food, energy budgets begin to shift. Once energy shifts, larger brains and longer childhoods become more sustainable. Once childhood lengthens, learning deepens. Once learning deepens, culture becomes harder to separate from biology. Once populations spread across continents, diversity multiplies. Once different humans meet, genes and ideas can cross. Once symbolic thought and social memory expand far enough, the species begins to build environments that feed back into its own future. None of those changes alone explains the whole. Together they form a chain of consequences so powerful that a lineage once living at the edge of broken forests eventually becomes a species that carries whole worlds in its head. Yet for all that transformation, the old inheritance never disappears. Modern humans are still primates in every basic sense that matters. The hand that types, carves, points, and writes is still the altered hand of a climber. The eyes that scan a screen or a horizon are still forward-facing primate eyes shaped by depth and attention. The face that speaks language and conceals thought is still built from ancient social machinery designed to read others quickly and constantly. The need for belonging, the sensitivity to rank, the deep unease of exclusion, the attachment to the young, the reflex to watch the intentions of other bodies. These are not late decorations laid over an animal core. They are the core, elaborated across time. Even the human mind at its most abstract remains tied to memory, alliance, imitation, fear, and curiosity inherited from a primate past. This is one reason the phrase accidental mutation feels both wrong and revealing. It is wrong because it compresses too much into one imagined event. No single change in DNA creates a human. No solitary accident explains upright walking, language, fire, cooperation, and symbolic thought. But it is revealing because chance truly does run through the entire story. Mutations arise without foresight, climates swing without concern. Populations become isolated by geography no mind intends. Encounters between lineages occur because roots cross at the right moment. Extinction takes one branch and spares another for reasons that are often statistical before they are dramatic. Human origins are not a design but a history, and history is always full of accident. What transforms accident into ancestry is the long filtering work of survival. The Denisovans make that especially clear. They remain among the most haunting figures in the human past precisely because they show how little visibility evolution requires in order to matter. A tiny finger bone, a few teeth, fragmentary traces in cave sediments, and a genetic legacy living in later populations are enough to reveal a whole branch of humanity once missing from science. Their bodies remain mostly hidden, their range only partly known, their cultures and appearance still debated, and yet they live on in the story decisively. They prove that major human lineages can remain almost invisible in the fossil record. They prove that human evolution includes mixture as well as divergence. They prove that survival may continue in forms other than outward continuity. In that sense, Denisovans stand as a warning against certainty. The visible record is not the whole record. The past is larger than the bones we happen to find. Neanderthals make a different kind of correction. For too long they were treated as the failed version of ourselves, the wrong answer beside the right one. Now they appear less as foils and more as kin humans of cold Eurasian worlds, immensely capable, durable, and adaptive, though ultimately unable to persist as a separate population. Homo erectus pushes the correction farther back still, reminding us that success in evolution cannot be measured only by resemblance to us. Few hominin lineages endure longer or spread more widely. Even the robust Australopithecines, often cast as side branches, testify to the richness of the experiment. Human evolution is not a pageant arranged to produce modern observers. It is a long field of real lives, most of them ending without descendants, all of them fully present in their own time. And that may be the most important legacy of all. When modern people ask how apes became human, they often mean when intelligence appeared, when language appeared, when consciousness appeared, when the first truly human being arrived. The deeper answer is that no such moment can bear the whole burden. Humanity is not a switch turned on. It is a widening accumulation of capacities walking, carrying, shaping, sharing, remembering, teaching, adapting, mixing, imagining. Different parts of that package appear at different times and in different branches. Some appear before the genus Homo. Some appear outside our own species. Some are shared more widely across the human family than once believed. The result is not a single threshold crossed once, but a long corridor of thresholds, most of them only visible in hindsight. What remains today is the only surviving human species, but not the only human history. In every language, every city, every migration, every inheritance of face and physiology, every child dependent on years of care before adulthood, the deep structure of the story is still present. Humans remain a species built on prolonged learning, social dependence, energy extraction, environmental change, and the continuous reshaping of the world through knowledge passed across generations. That is the gift and danger of the lineage alike. The same capacities that once allowed survival in unstable prehistoric landscapes now allow the remaking of climates, oceans, forests, and the future of countless other species. The old evolutionary bargain has expanded to planetary scale. So the legacy of becoming human is not merely that one lineage survived, it is that one lineage learned, step by step, how to survive by storing more of the world outside itself and more of the past within itself, in tools, in fire, in memory, in children, in stories, in genes, in places revisited and altered. The human line became cumulative. It became historical in a way no earlier ape had been. And once that happened, extinction no longer meant only the disappearance of bodies. It meant the loss of songs never sung again, roots never walked again, faces never fully reconstructed, and entire ways of being human that vanished before anyone could write them down. The last surviving branch carries all of that absence with it, even when it does not know their names. The story ends where it began, in uncertainty. But now the uncertainty feels larger and quieter. Somewhere in ancient Africa, a primate lineage lives at the edge of changing forests and does not know it is carrying the beginning of anything. Much later, in caves, on plains, in frozen valleys, on mountain routes, and beside forgotten fires, other human lineages live out complete worlds of their own and do not know they will vanish almost without a face in memory. What remains of them comes down in fragments, a footprint in ash, a jaw in sediment, a scatter of flint, a tooth in a cave, a pulse of inherited DNA in the blood of people who have never heard their names. And perhaps that is the calmest truth the long history leaves behind. Humanity is not the opposite of disappearance. It is one brief resistance to it. Bodies change, branches divide, climates turn, species fade, and memory is always partial. Yet for a while, against all of that erasure, one lineage learns to carry traces forward. It carries them in bones, in habits, in tools, in children taught how to survive, in old genes crossing into new populations, in stories built to hold the past a little longer than the body can. The forests that shaped the first steps are gone in their ancient form. The Ice Age valleys where other humans walked have changed beyond recognition. The fires have gone cold. The caves remain, but only as still places where sediment keeps its patience. And still, the living world is full of those absences. In every human face there is a history of older faces behind it. In every hand there is the memory of branches, stone, marrow, and flame. In every long childhood there is the deep old cost of learning how to become the kind of creature that survives by remembering. So the last image is not of triumph. It is of continuity held briefly against time, a cold cave mouth opening into dusk, wind moving over grass where feet once passed and left no mark that lasted, a small fire somewhere in the dark, then ash, then earth, then silence. And beyond that silence, much later, the strange endurance of descendants still trying to understand how they came to be here at all.